There is a moment in the study of war when the documents stop making clean sense, when the organizational charts, the sortie logs, the after-action reports, all of it begins to ask a question that military history rarely permits itself to ask openly. Not how did this happen, but why did men do this? Why did young men, some no older than 19, climb into aircraft they knew would never land, point themselves at steel hulls crossing a grey Pacific Sea, and hold the course until the end? This is a documentary about that question, and it does not offer a simple answer, but because history rarely does. The word kamikaze comes from two Japanese characters, kami, meaning spirit or divinity, keize, meaning wind. Together, they conjure a very specific event from the 13th century. A pair of great typhoons that shattered Mongol invasion fleets off the coast of Japan in the years 1274 and 1281. Storms that the Japanese understood as divine intervention. The breath of heaven pushing back the forces of conquest. 700 years later, in the autumn of 1944, Japan's military leadership reached back into that legend and pulled it forward into the age of aviation. What you are about to watch is the complete history of the kamikaze at sea. It is a 3 to 4 hour journey through one of the most complex, most debated, and most misunderstood episodes of the Second World War. We will begin long before the first aircraft dived at a ship's deck, in the years when Japan's naval aviation was the finest in the world, when her pilots were the sharpest and most experienced carrier crews flying anywhere on Earth. We will watch how that force was ground down, battle by battle, island by island, until the commanders who remained were left with young men who had barely learned to fly, an aircraft that could no longer compete in a fair fight. And then we will watch what those commanders decided to do next. This is not a documentary that glorifies what happened. It is a documentary that takes it seriously, that looks at the planning rooms and the training airfields and the letters that young pilots wrote home, and tries to understand the machinery, cultural, strategic, military, that produced what the United States Navy would later call the most psychologically effective weapon it faced in the entire Pacific War. Before we begin, if you find this kind of long-form, research-driven history valuable, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. This channel exists because of viewers who care about history done properly. Now, settle in. We are going back to the beginning. Chapter 1: The World Before the Dive. Japanese naval aviation at its height. To understand the kamikaze, you first have to understand what was lost before it was invented. In the years before the Pacific War, Japan's naval air arm was something that very few Western analysts took seriously enough, and that misjudgment cost the Allied powers dearly in the opening months of the conflict. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had spent the 1930s forging its pilots in some of the harshest training conditions in the world. Candidates were selected with exceptional rigor. The pipeline was narrow by design. The Japanese military believed that producing a smaller number of extraordinarily skilled aviators was preferable to training a large volume of merely competent ones. This philosophy shaped everything that followed, both the extraordinary early triumphs and the catastrophic later failures. The aircraft that carried this elite force into the opening engagements of the Pacific War is still, to this day, one of the most recognized silhouettes in the history of aviation. The Mitsubishi A6M0, known to Allied forces by the reporting name Zeke, was an engineering achievement of its particular moment. It was extraordinarily light, with a range that exceeded anything the Americans or British could put in the air. From a carrier deck in 1941, its pilots could turn it through arcs that heavier, more structurally robust American fighters could not match. In the hands of experienced aviators who had already been sharpened in the skies over China, the Zero was not merely a capable aircraft. For a period of roughly 18 months, it was dominant. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, demonstrated what this force could accomplish at its height. More than 350 aircraft, launched in 2 waves from 6 fleet carriers, struck the United States Pacific Fleet at anchor in Hawaii in a coordinated operation of a complexity that few air forces anywhere in the world could have executed with such precision. The damage was severe. 8 American battleships were hit, and 4 were sunk or settled on the harbor floor. The psychological shock to the American public was profound, but historians who have studied Pearl Harbor closely have pointed out, repeatedly, that Japan's greatest error that morning was strategic rather than tactical. The failure to find and destroy the American aircraft carriers, which happened to be at sea. Those carriers would become the instruments of Japan's eventual destruction. Through the early months of 1942, the pattern of Japanese aerial dominance continued across a vast geography, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies to the waters off Ceylon. British naval force, including HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were located and struck off Malaya in December of 1941, one of the first demonstrations in history that surface ships without air cover could not survive in waters where an enemy held air superiority. The Royal Navy's losses there confirmed a lesson that would define naval strategy for the remainder of the war. Air power was no longer a support arm for surface fleets. It had become the primary instrument of naval warfare. But the period of Japanese dominance carried a fragility that was not immediately visible. Japan's aviation training system was producing pilots in insufficient numbers to replace the losses of an extended, large-scale war. The combat experience in China, which had honed an extraordinary generation of aviators, could not simply be replicated on demand. When those experienced men began to fall, in the carrier battles of 1942, in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, Japan was drawing down a resource that had no rapid replacement path. Each loss of a skilled pilot in the first generation was, in a very real structural sense, irreplaceable. The Americans were building thousands of aircraft per month and training pilots on an industrial scale. Japan was not. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 is where many historians locate the moment the balance shifted. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk in the space of 2 days. The aircraft aboard them, and many of the trained crews, went with them. This was not merely a loss of ships. It was the destruction of a concentrated, irreplaceable block of experienced naval air power. Japan would never again field a carrier force of the quality that had struck Pearl Harbor. The carriers she would put to sea in the following years would carry aircraft flown by men who had a fraction of the flying hours, a fraction of the combat experience, and a fraction of the confidence of the men who had been lost over the Pacific in June of 1942. In the Solomon Islands campaign, from 1942 through 43, the attrition continued. The aerial battles over Guadalcanal alone consumed hundreds of experienced Japanese aviators, men who had been sharpened over years, lost in the brutal daily arithmetic of a campaign that dragged on far longer than Japanese planners had anticipated. The American logistics system could sustain a lengthy grinding campaign. The Japanese training pipeline increasingly could not replace the human cost of one. Tropical disease degraded the readiness of ground crews and support personnel. Spare parts and aviation fuel became harder to move through a supply chain that American submarines were beginning to sever with increasing efficiency. By the end of 1943, Japan's naval air arm was in a state of decay that its surface fleet strength and its impressive island fortifications largely concealed from the outside world. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service with the United States Navy in early 1943 and changed the character of the Pacific Air War in a way that is worth pausing on. It was specifically designed to kill the Zero. American naval intelligence had recovered a largely intact Zero that had crash-landed on an Aleutian island in 1942, and Grumman's engineers studied it exhaustively. The Hellcat that emerged from that analysis was heavier, faster in a dive, better armored, and capable of sustaining damage that would have been fatal to the lighter Japanese fighter. It was also being produced in numbers that the Zero could not match. The Vought F-4U Corsair, already proving itself in Marine Corps operations, completed the picture of an American Air Force that had methodically addressed and solved the problem that had dominated the early months of the war. The men commanding Japan's naval aviation in late 1943 and through 1944 were not unintelligent, and they were not unaware of the direction events were moving. They watched the numbers, they read the reports, they understood that the arithmetic of production and training had turned against them in a way that tactical creativity alone could not correct. The question that occupied the more forward thinking of them, the question that would eventually produce the Special Attack Force, was not whether Japan could win the conventional air war against America's growing carrier fleet. By mid-1944, that was no longer seriously in doubt. The question was whether there existed any mechanism, any tactic, any use of the men and machines that remained, that could alter the strategic equation enough to matter. That question would receive its answer at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and that answer would be catastrophic. Chapter 2, The Great Collapse. Marianas, Turkey Shoot, and the End of Carrier Aviation. There is a particular quality to the moment when a strategy fails completely, not partially, not in ways that can be repaired and refined, but fundamentally at its core assumptions. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, on the 19th and 20th of June, 1944, was that kind of moment for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese planners called their operation Operation Ago. The logic was straightforward: draw the American carrier fleet into a decisive engagement in the Philippine Sea and destroy it. Japanese carriers had a longer-ranged aircraft than their American counterparts, and the plan was to exploit this by striking from beyond the range at which American aircraft could strike back, what the Japanese called the Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle strategy. It was the same doctrine that had governed Japanese naval planning for decades, updated now with the tactical specifics of carrier warfare. On paper, it possessed a certain coherence. On the 19th of June, 1944, it collided with operational reality. What the Japanese planners had not fully accounted for was the degree to which American technology, training, and coordination had evolved. The Americans were flying radar-directed combat air patrols, fighters vectored onto incoming Japanese aircraft by carriers with mature fighter direction systems, in a coordinated interception scheme that the Japanese had no equivalent for. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 was a different organism from the American carrier force. Japan had fought at Midway 2 years earlier. The Hellcat pilots waiting at altitude had been trained against the specific aerial characteristics of Japanese aircraft. The radar operators on the carriers and cruisers had hours of practice identifying and tracking incoming formations. The whole American system was a machine built to do precisely what it did on the 19th of June. The Japanese launched 4 major attack waves. The Americans intercepted them systematically, far out from the fleet, and the results were staggering. Of approximately 430 Japanese aircraft committed across both days of the battle, only 35 survived. American losses, by contrast, were around 123 aircraft. The majority of those lost in a difficult night recovery operation, rather than in aerial combat. The battle received its derisive nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, from an American aviator's radio transmission during the interceptions, likening the experience to a peacetime target exercise. It was a phrase that entered the historical record and never left it. partly because it captured something true about the mismatch in the air, and partly because it felt brutal enough to be honest. Below the aerial engagement, things went equally badly for Japan at sea. The submarine USS Kavala found and torpedoed the fleet carrier Shokaku, one of the carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. The carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, was hit by torpedoes from USS Albacore and sank after an internal fuel vapor explosion. A third carrier, Hio, was sunk by aircraft the following day. 3 fleet carriers in 2 days. The loss of ships was severe. The loss of aircraft and experienced air crews, men who represented years of careful, expensive, irreplaceable training, was something far worse than severe. It was, in the blunt language of post-war analysis, the destruction of Japan's remaining ability to conduct effective carrier aviation. Historians who have studied the Japanese after-action assessments of the Philippine Sea have noted that what is striking about the senior officers' responses is not denial. Many of them understood clearly what had happened, but rather the institutional difficulty of admitting the full scale of the strategic implications. The carriers could be repaired or replaced, in theory. The pilots could not. Japan had lost over 400 carrier-based aircraft and their crews in 48 hours. The training pipeline that had been struggling to produce adequate replacements since 1942 was not remotely capable of filling that void in any time frame that mattered. What remained of the carrier air arm after the Philippine Sea was, in practical terms, a force that could not be trusted to conduct sustained conventional air operations against a well-defended American fleet. The fall of Saipan to American forces in July of 1944 compounded the catastrophe. Saipan's capture placed the Mariana Islands in American hands, and that mattered enormously because it placed American Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers within striking range of the Japanese home islands. The strategic calculus shifted in ways that the Japanese High Command found deeply alarming. The home islands were no longer a distant backstop. They were now potentially a front line. The pace of American operations, island after island, each one bringing the advance closer to Japan proper, left very little room for the measured strategic reassessment that Japan's military culture, structured as it was around face-saving institutional protocols, made so difficult. It was in this context, a context of collapsing carrier aviation, strategic encirclement, and a training system that could no longer produce pilots fast enough to matter, that certain officers began to think seriously about a different kind of air attack. The logic was not, on its surface, the product of desperation alone. It was, in a cold and uncomfortable way, rational. A conventional air attack by poorly trained pilots flying outclassed aircraft against a well-defended American fleet had a very low probability of success and a very high probability of losing both aircraft and pilot without achieving anything. If the pilot was going to be lost anyway, if the statistics of combat in 1944 made his survival unlikely, then the only way to extract maximum military value from his sacrifice was to make the aircraft itself the weapon, remove the complexity of the bomb release, the attack geometry, the evasion after the run, remove the necessity of surviving, drive the aircraft and its payload directly into the target. This reasoning, clinical, terrible, and in its own terms internally consistent, was beginning to circulate in Japanese aviation circles through the summer of 1944. It did not yet have a name. It was not yet official policy, but the weight of strategic events was pushing Japanese military planning toward a place where it would become both. The man who would give it official form was waiting in Manila. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Decision. Vice Admiral Onishi and the First Unit. On the 19th of October, 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived at Mabalacat Airfield, known to the Americans as Clark Air Base, near Manila in the Philippines. He had recently been appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet. The operational situation he had inherited was, to use the only accurate word, desperate. His entire command consisted of 41 aircraft, 34 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 3 torpedo bombers, a pair of land-based bombers, and a single reconnaissance aircraft. Against this threadbare inventory, he was expected to provide air support for the Japanese naval forces attempting to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval engagements in history, fought over the waters off the Philippines through the last days of October. Onishi understood numbers. He understood that 41 aircraft could not meaningfully affect the outcome of a conventional naval battle fought by fleets of the scale now approaching Leyte Gulf. He also understood, and this is where historians have long debated the nature of his decision-making, that the Japanese naval leadership had committed to a plan that required the American carriers to be neutralized, or at minimum disrupted, if the surface fleet elements were to have any chance of reaching and destroying the American transport ships in the Gulf. Without air cover, the surface fleet would be destroyed. Without the surface fleet reaching its targets, the Philippines could not be held. Without the Philippines, Japan's sea lines to the oil fields of Southeast Asia would be severed, and the entire war economy would collapse within months. The stakes, in Onishi's view, demanded methods proportionate to them. On the evening of the 19th of October, in a meeting at Mabalacat with the officers of the 201st Flying Group headquarters, Onishi made his proposal explicit. He said, in the words recorded in Japanese accounts of the meeting, "In my opinion, there is only one way of assuring that our meager strength will be effective to a maximum degree. That is to organize suicide attack units composed of 0 fighters, armed with 250-kilogram bombs, with each plane to crash dive into an enemy carrier." He then left the room, reportedly in visible distress, asking his officers to discuss the proposal among themselves. The detail of the admiral leaving the room, the act of removing himself from the direct social pressure of a command decision, as if to permit something resembling voluntary consent, has attracted significant commentary from historians of Japanese military culture. It sits at the uncomfortable intersection of institutional coercion and individual agency that runs through the entire kamikaze story. Commander Asaichi Tamai carried the proposal to 23 young student pilots, all of whom he had personally trained. He asked whether any of them wished to volunteer for the Special Attack Force. Every hand went up. All 23 pilots raised both hands. Whether this unanimity reflected genuine individual conviction, the social pressure of the moment, or the cultural architecture of an institution in which refusal was effectively impossible is a question that historians have returned to repeatedly, and one that admits no single clean answer. The evidence of pilots' private letters, studied after the war, reveals a spectrum of feeling that is far more complicated than the image of serene, willing sacrifice that Japanese wartime propaganda promoted. The letters show love for family, grief at leaving, fear alongside resolution, duty expressed in terms that sometimes feel coerced and sometimes feel entirely genuine. Both things were true at once. Lieutenant Yukio Seki was asked to command the Special Attack Force. He became the 24th pilot selected. Accounts recorded after the war describe him pausing for 10 seconds, eyes closed, before accepting. He reportedly said, not in the official record, but in recollections gathered by post-war researchers, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots." And, in a separate account, "I am not going on this mission for the Emperor, or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." These words have been quoted in historical literature for decades. They are among the few documented glimpses of the private interior of the men who flew the first missions, a view that complicates every simple narrative. The 4 subunits of the Kamikaze Special Attack Force were named Shikishima, Yamato, Asahi, and Yamazakura. The names were taken from a poem by the 18th century Japanese classical scholar Motori Norinaga, which can be roughly translated as, "If someone asks about the spirit of Japan, it is the mountain cherry blossoms, fragrant in the morning sun." The choice of names is telling in itself. Not military designations, not numbers or tactical codes, but words from a poem about the fleeting beauty of blossoms. In Japanese culture, the cherry blossom is a symbol of impermanence, of something beautiful, precisely because its beauty does not last. Onishi, addressing the unit, told them that their nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin, even in defeat. The language was not tactical. It was something closer to eulogy, spoken in advance. The pilots would receive specific training in the mechanics of the attack itself. They were instructed on the most vulnerable points of American warships: the flight deck, the elevator mechanisms, the bridge structure. They were told not to close their eyes at any point during the final approach, as loss of sight would degrade accuracy. They were given instruction in how to orient their aircraft for maximum effect. A near vertical dive angle maximized both speed and penetrating force, driving the aircraft and its payload through the deck and into the structure below before the explosive detonated. These technical details, laid out in training documents, are worth noting because they push back against the idea that the kamikaze program was simply an act of pure desperation. Within its own terrible logic, it was organized, documented, and systematically taught. It was not a program of chaos. It was a program of controlled, directed, human-guided destruction. Onishi spent the night of the 19th of October at Mabalacat. By multiple accounts, he did not sleep. The following morning, the Special Attack Force began its preparations. The first mission was not yet launched. That would come on the 25th. But the machinery was now in motion. 41 aircraft, 4 subunits, 24 young men, and a name pulled from a medieval typhoon. The Pacific War had just entered a new phase that neither the men who flew these first missions, nor the men on the receiving end of them, had any real framework for understanding. The United States Navy, in the weeks and months ahead, would have to build that framework from scratch, under fire, in real time. Chapter 4, The First Blood, Leyte Gulf and the Sinking of USS St. Lo, the 25th of October, 1944, is a date that sits at a curious intersection in Pacific War historiography. It is the day of the Battle off Samar, arguably the most dramatic surface action of the entire war, in which a small American force of destroyers and escort carriers fought off a Japanese battleship force of overwhelming strength through a combination of audacity, smoke, and remarkable courage. And it is also the day the Kamikaze Special Attack Force flew its first officially sanctioned missions. Both events happened in the same waters, on the same morning, and together they illustrate the extraordinary complexity of what historians call the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Not a single battle, but a series of interconnected engagements across hundreds of nautical miles of Philippine waters, fought over 4 days, and involving more ships than any naval battle before or since. A note on what happened in the days just preceding this. On the 21st of October, a Japanese aircraft had deliberately crashed into the foremast of the heavy cruiser Anechmas, Australia, an Australian vessel operating as part of the Allied force. The attack killed 30 personnel, including the ship's captain, Émile Deschaneur, and wounded 64, including the Australian force commander, Commodore John Collins. Whether this constitutes the first kamikaze attack is a question that various sources dispute. The aircraft was not from the official Special Attack Force, and the action appears to have been an individual pilot's decision rather than a planned suicide strike. The Australian official history of the war claimed it as the first kamikaze attack on an Allied ship. The historiographical debate around this point is itself instructive. It reveals how difficult it is to draw a clean line between the informal, individual, last resort crash dive and the institutionalized, trained, doctrine-based suicide attack that the Kamikaze Special Attack Force represented. On the morning of the 25th of October, 5 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros of the Special Attack Force, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, were escorted toward their targets by Japan's leading surviving ace, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, a figure of legendary status in Japanese naval aviation, flying escort rather than attack in a detail that historians have found poignant. The 5 Zeros attacked several American escort carriers, operating in the waters off Samar. The first Zero attempted to hit the bridge of USS Kitkoon Bay, but struck the port catwalk instead and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 others dived at USS Fanshawe Bay and were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire before reaching the ship. The last 2, Seki among them, ran at USS White Plains. Seki, under heavy anti-aircraft fire and with his aircraft visibly trailing smoke, aborted his approach on White Plains and instead banked toward a nearby escort carrier, USS St. Lo. His aircraft struck the flight deck. The bomb he carried penetrated through the deck before detonating, and the resulting fires reached the carrier's bomb magazine. The magazine exploded. St. Lo sank within approximately 30 minutes. She was a small carrier, a Casablanca-class escort carrier, displacing roughly around 11,000 tons loaded, not the fleet carrier that Onishi had envisioned as the primary target of the Special Attack Force. But she was a warship. She had gone to the bottom, and the method that had sunk her had worked. Later on the same day, further strikes by kamikaze pilots from the Special Attack Force and other units damaged 3 large escort carriers: USS Sangamon, USS Santee, and USS Suwannee, as well as 3 smaller escorts. By the end of the 26th of October, in total across the 2 days, 7 carriers had been hit, and 40 other ships had been struck, with 5 sunk, 23 heavily damaged, and 12 more moderately damaged. For a force that had begun with 41 aircraft, these were not negligible results. The Japanese High Command and its propaganda apparatus seized on them immediately. The program was not merely continued, it was expanded. There is a human dimension to this day that the numbers alone do not capture. The men on the American ships who witnessed what happened to St. Lo, who watched an aircraft come down in a deliberate, controlled dive directly into a ship, and watched the ship cease to exist within half an hour, were confronted with something for which their training had not prepared them psychologically. The conventional air attack, even the torpedo run, even the dive bombing run, involves an adversary who is trying to survive. The psychological contract of conventional warfare, however brutal, contains an implicit understanding that both sides are attempting to live. What the crews of the escort carriers witnessed on the 25th of October did not contain that understanding. It was something qualitatively different, and the accounts written by survivors in the hours and days afterward reflect that difference consistently and vividly. Words like deliberate, relentless, and unstoppable recur. Vice Admiral Onishi, receiving the after-action reports, is recorded as having wept. He had spent the night before the first missions unable to sleep. He now understood that the program he had initiated was going to be expanded far beyond the 41 aircraft and 24 pilots of the original Special Attack Force. The Japanese High Command was already calling for more units, more volunteers, more aircraft. The mechanism was in motion, and it was going to accelerate. Whether Onishi's tears were grief for the men he had sent, satisfaction at what they had achieved, or some mixture of the two that cannot be separated, this is another of the questions that the historical record does not cleanly resolve. The Americans had to figure out what they were dealing with. They had to figure it out quickly, and the next time the kamikaze came in numbers, not 5 aircraft but waves of dozens, the defenses would need to be substantially better than what had existed on the 25th of October. That reckoning was coming within days. Chapter 5. The Logic of the Weapon, Aircraft, Tactics, and the Mechanics of a Kamikaze Strike. One of the elements of kamikaze history that is least often examined carefully, and that rewards careful examination, is the practical, mechanical question of how these attacks actually worked. Not in ideological terms, in engineering terms, in tactical terms. What made a kamikaze more dangerous than a conventional air attack by the same pilot in the same aircraft? And what were the vulnerabilities of the method that Allied defenders eventually learned to exploit? The primary aircraft used in kamikaze strikes was the Mitsubishi A6M0, the same fighter that had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and 42. By 1944, it was no longer competitive in a conventional dogfight against the Hellcat or the Corsair. It was underpowered, under-armored, and outturned at high speeds. But as a delivery vehicle for a 250-kilogram bomb in a final, one-way dive run, its characteristics were somewhat more useful. Its relatively light structure and the absence of any need to recover from the dive meant that piloting technique could be optimized entirely for the attack run rather than for survivability or post-attack maneuver. Approximately 650 Zero fighters were expended in kamikaze missions over the course of the program, more than any other aircraft type, but a wide variety of aircraft were used. Obsolete biplane trainers, torpedo bombers, twin-engine bombers, and purpose-built aircraft all participated at various points. The purpose-built aircraft merits particular attention because it represents the point at which the program moved beyond opportunistic use of existing inventory and into deliberate engineering. The Yokosuka MXY-7, given the name Oka, meaning cherry blossom, was a rocket-powered glider designed exclusively to kill ships. It was conceived by a Japanese naval transport pilot named Mitsuo Ota, who had been thinking about the problem of attacking heavily defended American fleets with the aircraft available. His initial proposals were not acted upon immediately, but by June of 1944, following the catastrophic losses in the Marianas, the naval arsenal at Yokosuka took over development. Test flights of a rocket-powered version began in October of 1944, with a successful powered test in November. The Oka was approximately 6 meters long, with a wingspan of roughly 5 meters. Its operational version, the Model 11, carried a warhead of approximately 1,200 kilograms. It was powered by 3 solid-fuel rocket motors that gave it a maximum speed in a powered dive of over 600 kilometers per hour. Estimates vary, but the aircraft was unquestionably faster than any Allied fighter or anti-aircraft solution then available once the rockets were ignited. Its weakness was its dependency on a carrier aircraft, typically a Mitsubishi G4M twin-engine bomber, to bring it within range of the target. The parent bomber had to fly at relatively low speed while carrying the Oka beneath its fuselage, and this made it deeply vulnerable to the American Combat Air Patrol. The Americans, once they understood the threat, directed specific interception effort at the G4M formations. In the Oka's first combat deployment, in March of 1945, 16 G4M bombers carrying Oka were intercepted by American fighters before they could release their weapons, and every single bomber was destroyed. A conventional air attack required a pilot to calculate bomb release point, manage approach angle, account for ship movement, and then recover from the dive. A sequence of tasks that demanded substantial training and experience to execute accurately against a maneuvering, firing target. A kamikaze pilot had no release calculation, no recovery requirement, and no post-attack evasion to manage. He had one task: hold the course and reach the target. The elimination of these additional variables meant that the tactic was, in a specific technical sense, somewhat more forgiving of inexperience than a conventional precision attack. This is one of the reasons the Japanese High Command found it operationally appealing in the context of a training crisis. The pilots it was producing by late 1944 were not capable of executing precision conventional bombing with any reliability, but they could, potentially, be directed at a target they could see. The training they received, though compressed, was specific. Pilots were taught the vulnerable anatomy of American warships, where the flight deck was most damageable, how the elevator mechanisms related to the flight deck, where the magazines were likely to be located relative to structures they could identify from the air. They were taught approach angles, a steep dive maximized both terminal velocity and the penetrating effect of the aircraft on the deck structure. They were instructed repeatedly to keep their eyes open throughout the final approach. The manual excerpt that has survived in post-war literature includes the passage, "When you eliminate all thoughts about life and death, you will be able to totally disregard your earthly life. This will also enable you to concentrate your attention on eradicating the enemy with unwavering determination, meanwhile reinforcing your excellence in flight skills." This sentence has been studied extensively by historians of military psychology. It is, simultaneously, a piece of tactical instruction and something that belongs more to the vocabulary of Zen practice than to an aviator's checklist. The effect of a successful kamikaze strike on a ship depended on multiple factors: the size of the aircraft, the weight and type of its bomb load, the angle and speed of impact, and crucially, where on the ship the strike landed. On American carriers with wooden flight decks, a burning aircraft loaded with explosives striking the deck could cause catastrophic fires, particularly if the flight deck was crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. The USS Bunker Hill, struck by two kamikaze aircraft on the 11th of May, 1945, while conducting flight operations with a full deck of armed planes, lost 389 men and was so severely damaged it took no further part in the war. The USS Franklin, in a separate attack that combined conventional dive bombing with kamikaze escort, was the most heavily damaged American carrier to survive the war. The ship's survival owed everything to the extraordinary damage control effort of her crew. British carriers in the Pacific War operated with armored steel flight decks rather than the wooden decks of their American counterparts. And this structural difference produced outcomes that the Americans noted with considerable professional interest. When a kamikaze struck a British carrier, HMS Formidable was hit on the 4th of May, 1945, leaving a crater roughly 3 meters long in the flight deck. Damage control crews repaired the deck with concrete and steel plate and had aircraft landing again within hours. The American Naval Liaison Officer attached to HMS Indefatigable observed at the time, "When a kamikaze hits a US carrier, it means 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers, man your brooms." This anecdote has appeared in countless histories of the Pacific War, sometimes lightly, as if it is simply a good story. But its implications for naval architecture and for the post-war design of British and American carriers were taken entirely seriously. The approximately 19% success rate of kamikaze attacks, roughly 1 in 5 achieving a hit or damaging near miss, as the United States Strategic Bombing Survey later calculated, needs to be understood in context. Against a conventional precision bombing campaign conducted by the undertrained aviators Japan had available in late 1944, the hit rate would have been substantially lower. The kamikaze was, within its brutal internal logic, a more efficient use of the resources Japan had left. That efficiency was not enough to change the war's outcome, but it was enough to kill nearly 5,000 American sailors and wound more than 4,800. Enough to sink 34 ships and damage 368 more. Enough to divert more than 2,000 Boeing B-29 sorties from strategic bombing of Japanese cities to a attacking kamikaze airfields in Kyushu. These are not insignificant numbers. The kamikaze was a terrible weapon. It was also, by the hard measure of military effectiveness, a weapon that worked, just not enough to matter strategically. Chapter 6: Volunteers and Compulsion. Who were the men who flew? Here is where the historical record becomes genuinely difficult, not in the sense of unclear. The documentary evidence from this period of the war is substantial. Difficult in the sense that it resists the clean, simple frames that popular history generally requires. The men who flew kamikaze missions were not a single type. They did not feel a single way. And the question of whether they volunteered freely is one that can be answered honestly only by saying, it is complicated, and the complication matters. The Japanese military leadership, from the moment the program was announced, emphasized voluntarism. Captain Motoharu Okamura, the officer who, before Onishi, had been among the first to advocate formally for suicide attack tactics, described receiving so many volunteers that he compared them to a swarm of bees, saying, "Bees die after they have stung." When volunteers arrived for duty in the Special Attack Corps, there were reportedly twice as many men as there were aircraft available. These anecdotes were prominent in Japanese wartime propaganda and have been repeated so often that they have acquired the weight of established fact. But they require scrutiny because the social and institutional context in which those volunteering decisions were made was not remotely neutral. Japan's military culture in 1944 was structured by values and social pressures that made refusal, in practice, extraordinarily costly. The Bushido Code, the warrior's way, with its emphasis on honor, loyalty, and the preference for death over surrender or shame, was not merely a philosophical tradition by the time of the Pacific War. It had been actively institutionalized, systematically reinforced by military training, by state propaganda, by the educational system, and by a culture in which the dishonor of an individual fell on his entire family. A young pilot in late 1944, who declined to volunteer for the Special Attack Force, was not simply making a private personal choice. He was potentially marking himself and his family with permanent social shame in a society that took shame with deadly seriousness. The voluntarism in this structural context was real and coerced simultaneously. Both things were true at once. The average age of a kamikaze pilot was 19. Many had never seen combat before their final mission. The earlier special attack missions, the ones carried out in October and November of 1944, were flown largely by men with more experience. Men who had at least been through the training that characterized the pre-decline Japanese aviation system. As the program expanded through 1945, and as the experience pool was consumed, the men sent on these missions were increasingly students, university students whose education had been cut short by accelerated conscription. Young men who had learned to fly in months rather than years. Some historians have noted that this demographic shift had an effect on the emotional character of the letters and diaries left behind. The earlier pilots' writings tend toward a certain martial formality. The later pilots, the students, write more about their families, more about things they had not yet experienced, more about the simple fact of being young. An evidence-based study of approximately 2,000 uncensored letters written by kamikaze pilots and examined by post-war researchers reveals a range of private emotion that the official propaganda account obscured almost entirely. The men in those letters expressed determination alongside fear, love of family alongside duty to the emperor, grief at dying young alongside something that in some cases does appear to be genuine acceptance. The average pilot was unmarried. Some who were young fathers left careful instructions for their wives and children. Some wrote about unrequited love, experiences they would never have the chance to pursue. Some wrote about sunsets they had seen from the cockpit during training flights. about specific meals they remembered from home, about small, precise things that the mind reaches for when it knows its future has been foreclosed. Tsuneo Watanabe, the editor-in-chief of the Yomiuri Shimbun, one of Japan's most prominent newspapers, stated in 2006, "It's all a lie that they left filled with braveness and joy, crying, 'Long live the emperor.' They were sheep at a slaughterhouse. Everybody was looking down and tottering. Some were unable to stand up and were carried and pushed into their aircraft by maintenance soldiers." This statement, made by a Japanese journalist reflecting on nationalist mythology more than 60 years after the war, is sharply polemical, and it has drawn criticism from historians who consider it an overstatement in the opposite direction from official propaganda. The truth, as the letters make clear, is neither the serene, joyful sacrifice of propaganda nor the uniform, coerced despair of Watanabe's formulation. Individual men brought individual feelings to individual missions. The pattern within the variants is, most of them were frightened. Most of them went anyway. The reasons for going were multiple, and not all of them were freely chosen. There is a biographical figure from this period who appears in several historical accounts, and who is worth holding in mind, not because his story is unique, but because it is representative. Lieutenant Seki, the commander of the first mission, who accepted his appointment after 10 seconds of closed-eyed thought, and who said privately that Japan's future was bleak if it had to kill men like him. He was 23 years old and had been married for less than a year. His wife, Mariko, received his personal effects after his death. In the account recorded by post-war researchers, she stated that he had not wanted to go, that he had told her as much, and that he had gone because he felt he had no choice that left his honor intact within the system he inhabited. This is a small, private human detail in a story full of large institutional forces, but it is the kind of detail that keeps history honest, that prevents the narrative from collapsing into abstractions about strategy and national character and military necessity, and anchors it back to the person sitting in the cockpit on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944. The program was expanding. More units were being formed across the home islands, in Taiwan, in the Philippines. The aircraft being prepared went far beyond the original 41 Zeros of the 1st Air Fleet. The Japanese military was building a system, not just improvising a tactic. By the end of 1944, the program had a doctrine, a training framework, a supply chain of aircraft, and a growing roster of young men moving through it. The men in that roster understood broadly what they had signed or been signed for. The war was not over. The hardest and most consequential phase of the kamikaze campaign had not yet arrived. That phase would come in the spring of 1945, off a small island whose name every American sailor in the Pacific Fleet had already learned to dread. The island was Okinawa, and what happened there, in the ships, in the water, in the air, is where this story reaches its most brutal and most consequential chapter. Chapter 7, The American Response, Radar Pickets, Combat Air Patrols, and the Science of Survival. There is a particular kind of institutional learning that happens under fire. Not in training manuals, not in peacetime exercises, but in the actual lived experience of being hit and surviving, and then asking with absolute seriousness how to make sure it does not happen the same way twice. After the first kamikaze strikes of October and November 1944, the United States Navy did exactly this. It was not a slow process, it could not be. The next major kamikaze effort was weeks away, and the scale of what was coming, though not yet known precisely, was already suggested by the intelligence reports reaching fleet commanders. The fundamental problem the Navy faced was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to solve. A kamikaze aircraft, unlike a conventional bomber, had no escape maneuver, no pullout, no surviving pilot to interrogate. Its trajectory was its purpose. Every variable in a conventional air attack The pilot's willingness to press through heavy fire, the difficulty of releasing a bomb with precision under evasive maneuver, the need to survive the attack for the mission to make sense. These had been removed. What remained was a machine and a man committed to a single geometric problem. Reach the ship. Defending against it required detecting the aircraft as early as possible, intercepting it as far from the fleet as possible, and when it got through, because sometimes it would get through, being able to limit the damage through rapid damage control and structural design. Radar was the first line of the solution, and the Americans had been steadily developing their radar capability throughout the Pacific War. By late 1944, Task Force 58's carrier groups were surrounded by a network of radar-equipped destroyers whose specific job was early warning. These ships were positioned on the approaches to the fleet, typically at distances of roughly 60 to 80 nautical miles, to detect incoming aircraft far enough out that the combat air patrol could be vectored to intercept before the attackers reached the carriers. The principle was straightforward. In execution, it placed the radar picket destroyers in one of the most dangerous positions in the Pacific War. They were small ships, they were visible on the surface, and the kamikaze pilots, once they understood the picket system, learned to target them specifically, both as a means of disrupting the early warning network, and because a destroyer was a real warship, a legitimate and substantial military target. The men who served aboard the radar picket destroyers off Okinawa in 1945 suffered casualties that are still not widely known outside specialized naval history, and their experience deserves a full examination. One we will give it when we reach the Okinawa chapter. Fighter direction, the practice of talking combat air patrol pilots onto incoming aircraft using radar tracking, had been developing steadily since the early carrier battles of 1942. By 1945, it had matured into a sophisticated, practiced coordination between radar operators on carriers and cruisers, fighter direction officers interpreting the picture on their screens, and Hellcat and Corsair pilots in the air above the fleet. The system required specific training, specific protocols, and experienced operators who could manage multiple intercept vectors simultaneously in a fast-moving tactical picture. The Americans had all of this by the spring of 1945. But the sheer volume of aircraft Japan was now committing to the kamikaze program in mass raids called kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum, tested the system to its limits and beyond. 10 kikusui operations were launched against Allied forces at Okinawa between the 6th of April and the 22nd of June, 1945. In total, across these 10 mass raids, Japan committed approximately 1,465 kamikaze sorties, alongside a further 1,000 conventional attack sorties. Against these numbers, the combat air patrol system was effective, but not perfect, and perfection was the only thing that would keep every ship safe. The Hellcat pilots flying intercept patrols were working continuously. The operation's tempo for fighter pilots off the Okinawa campaign was, by the accounts of the men who flew it, the most physically and psychologically exhausting flying any of them had encountered in the war. Multiple missions per day, multiple days in succession, often in reduced visibility conditions at extended ranges from the carrier, against an enemy who could not be deterred, could not be driven off, and did not turn back. The mental weight of that reality, of facing an adversary who had removed the survival instinct from the engagement, pressed on these men in ways that conventional aerial combat did not. Anti-aircraft gunnery was also evolving rapidly. The proximity fuse, a radar-equipped shell that detonated automatically when it passed within a certain distance of an aircraft, was among the most significant technological developments of the entire Pacific War, and it had been introduced in quantity to American surface forces beginning in 1943, against a conventional aircraft attempting a bomb run and then recovering. The probability of a proximity-fused shell intercepting the aircraft was considerably higher than with time-fused or impact-fused ammunition. Against a kamikaze, the proximity fuse gave American anti-aircraft gunnery a meaningful advantage. The aircraft did not need to be destroyed outright, merely disrupted enough to deflect it from its aim point. A kamikaze aircraft hit in the final seconds of its dive that managed to impact the sea, rather than the flight deck, represented a success for the defense, even if the aircraft was not destroyed cleanly. The 4-centimeter Bofors gun, an automatic cannon firing at high rates, became particularly valued in close-range defense, and ships that had taken kamikaze damage in the early months of the campaign were frequently refitted to increase their close-range anti-aircraft battery before returning to sea. Damage control became simultaneously a science and an art. The United States Navy's damage control training, already extensive before the Pacific War, was intensified and refined based on the specific lessons of kamikaze strikes. Aviation gasoline fires, the particular challenge of burning aviation fuel, spreading across a flight deck, and finding its way below through any opening, became a studied speciality. Ships were modified to improve their ability to isolate fire. Crew training in fire suppression under combat conditions was expanded. The experience of vessels like USS Franklin, so severely damaged in March of 1945 that she lost more than 800 of her crew, yet survived and reached American waters under her own power, validated the investment in damage control training in terms that no peacetime exercise could have produced. The men who fought those fires, in the heat and the smoke and the ongoing danger of exploding ordnance, performed acts that naval historians have documented with appropriate care, and their contribution to the survival of their ships is as much a part of the kamikaze story as the attacks themselves. The British Pacific Fleet, operating as Task Force 57 under American overall command in the Okinawa campaign, brought a different set of answers to the same problem. The armored flight decks of HMS Indomitable, HMS Illustrious, HMS Formidable, and HMS Victorious provided a structural resilience that American wooden-decked carriers did not have. When HMS Formidable was hit on the 4th of May, 1945, the armored deck contained the damage sufficiently that flight operations were resumed within hours. The contrast with what a comparable strike would have done to an American carrier of equivalent type was noted at the highest levels of Allied naval command. And, as already mentioned, it was noted by the men on those ships in terms that were considerably less diplomatic. The tactical implication was absorbed. The post-war design direction of American carriers began moving, gradually, toward the structural lessons demonstrated by the British armoured deck. One element of the American response that is less often discussed is psychological and institutional. The United States Navy had to find a way of managing the morale and fighting effectiveness of crews who were facing something with no historical precedent in their experience of naval warfare. The deliberate, controlled, human-guided crash of a manned aircraft into a ship created a particular form of psychological stress that did not respond to the conventional tools for managing combat stress. Naval psychiatrists attached to Pacific Fleet ships in this period noted in their reports a specific pattern in the stress responses of crews who had experienced kamikaze attacks, particularly the expectation of further attacks, the inability to relax during any period of relative quiet, and a form of hypervigilance that degraded performance over prolonged operations. The Navy's response was pragmatic: rotation of crews when operationally possible, increased emphasis on in-theater recreation and rest, and a deliberate effort to frame the kamikaze threat in tactical rather than supernatural terms in the briefings and communications given to sailors. Whether this last measure was entirely successful is debatable. The men on the radar picket destroyers, waiting in open water for aircraft to come for them specifically, experienced the tactical framing and the psychological reality as substantially different things. By the spring of 1945, the Allied response to the kamikaze had evolved into a layered system. Early warning radar, combat air patrol intercept, heavy anti-aircraft fire, close-range automatic weapons, armored decks where available, and well-drilled damage control teams. That significantly reduced the proportion of kamikaze attacks that achieved their intended effect. The approximately 19% hit rate cited in post-war analysis was the figure achieved against this evolved, hardened defense system. Against earlier and less prepared defenses, the figure had been higher. The evolution of the American response is itself a significant military story, the story of an industrial and organizational power applying its characteristic strengths to a new and unexpected problem, methodically and with considerable effect. It did not stop the kamikaze campaign, it limited it, and in a war being decided by margins, limiting it mattered enormously. The cost of the limiting was borne by specific men on specific ships. The radar picket destroyer crews most prominently, but also the fighter pilots flying exhausting combat air patrols, and the damage control teams who fought fires in the spaces below decks that no one who has not stood in a burning ship at sea can fully imagine from the outside. These men's contributions to the Allied victory in the Pacific are inseparable from the broader story of the kamikaze campaign. The story of the attackers and the story of the defenders are the same story, told from different sides of the same stretch of water. Chapter 8, Expanding Empire. The kamikaze program at full scale. What began in October of 1944 with 41 aircraft and 4 named subunits became, by the spring of 1945, an enterprise of extraordinary scale. Understanding the size and organizational complexity of the kamikaze program at its height is essential to understanding both its military impact and the nature of Japan's strategic thinking in the final year of the war. This was not a desperate improvisation maintained on its original scale. It was a program that the Japanese High Command chose deliberately to expand, resource, and institutionalize, because the results, measured against the alternatives, appeared to justify the expansion. By the end of the war, Japanese sources and the United States Strategic Bombing Survey together estimate that approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in their missions, and a further 7,000 conventional support personnel. Escort pilots, ground crews, maintenance workers were killed in related operations. The number of aircraft committed to suicide missions is estimated at roughly 3,800 to 4,000 aircraft of all types, across all theaters of the Pacific War's final year. These are not the numbers of a tactical footnote. They represent a mobilization of human and material resources on a scale that required deliberate, sustained organizational commitment at the highest levels of Japanese military command. The expansion of the program was driven partly by the early results at Leyte Gulf and in the Philippines campaign, which appeared in the framing of Japanese operational analysis to validate the tactic. It was driven partly by the escalating urgency of the American advance. The liberation of the Philippines through early 1945, the fall of Iwo Jima in March after one of the war's bloodiest island battles, and the impending invasion of Okinawa all created specific operational moments at which Japan's high command concluded that only the kamikaze could provide meaningful resistance to American naval power. And it was driven partly by the structural reality that the kamikaze was now one of the very few offensive options Japan possessed that could be executed with the human and material resources that remained available. New units were formed throughout the Japanese home islands in Taiwan and in the remaining Japanese-held territory in the Philippines and throughout the Western Pacific. Pilots were organized into units with names drawn from Japanese poetry, nature, and classical literature. Shichisei, 7 stars; Nitaka, a mountain peak on Taiwan; Jinbu, kamikaze, in its pure form as a name rather than just a descriptor, and dozens of others. Each name carried resonance within Japanese cultural tradition. The systematic naming of death-bound units using words drawn from the natural world and classical aesthetics was not accidental. It was a deliberate cultural technology of the Japanese military, an effort to frame what was being asked of these young men within the most honorable and meaningful vocabulary available. Whether it succeeded in that framing, whether the men themselves experienced their mission in the terms their names suggested, is one of the questions that the private letters answer partially and inconclusively. The aircraft inventory of the expanded program was as varied as the units. Beyond the Zero fighters and the Oka rocket gliders, kamikaze units operated the Aichi D-3A carrier dive bomber, already obsolete by Pacific War standards, the Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber, the twin-engine Mitsubishi G-4M, and a range of training aircraft that had been pressed into operational service as the conventional inventory was consumed. The use of biplane training aircraft in kamikaze attacks is among the details most cited by historians to illustrate the degree of resource constraint Japan was operating under by 1945. These were aircraft with cruising speeds so low that a Hellcat pilot could fire on them while barely maneuvering. And yet they were used because they were available and because a biplane loaded with explosives and guided to its target by a determined pilot could still damage a ship if the defenses were saturated. The tactic of sending large waves, the Kikusui mass raids, was partly driven by this reality. Individually, many of these aircraft were easy targets. In mass, they overwhelmed the capacity of combat air patrols and anti-aircraft batteries to deal with every threat simultaneously. The logistics of the expanded program required a substantial support infrastructure. Airfields across Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main home islands, and the closest to the battle zone at Okinawa, were developed as kamikaze bases. The Americans understood this and directed significant resources at suppressing these airfields. Carrier aircraft struck Kyushu repeatedly, and as noted earlier, more than 2,000 B-29 sorties were diverted from strategic bombing to attacking kamikaze bases and fuel supplies. This diversion itself represents a significant operational effect of the kamikaze campaign. Not only the ships damaged and sunk, but the distortion of American offensive planning imposed by the need to suppress the source of the attacks. The Japanese High Command was aware of this effect and considered it a secondary strategic benefit. Even when kamikaze aircraft were destroyed on the ground rather than reaching their targets, they were compelling the Americans to spend resources defending against them rather than advancing. The selection and training process at full scale was qualitatively different from the careful selection of the first unit in October of 1944. By 1945, the training pipeline had been compressed to a degree that alarmed even some Japanese officers who had been strong supporters of the program. Reports from training units in Kyushu describe pilots being sent on missions after training periods of between 30 and 50 hours of total flying time. In some documented cases, less. For comparison, an American Navy fighter pilot in 1945 arrived at a fleet squadron with several hundred hours of training, including dedicated combat training phases. The gap in flying competence between the average American fighter pilot and the average late-war kamikaze pilot was, in terms of conventional aerial skills, enormous. For the kamikaze mission specifically, fly to the target, dive on the ship, the gap mattered somewhat less, but it still mattered. Poorly trained pilots misjudged approach angles, misidentified targets, and were more vulnerable to interception because their flying was less precise and less adaptable than that of experienced aviators. The social and institutional machinery of the expanded program is one of the most studied aspects of kamikaze history, particularly by Japanese scholars and memoirists, who have returned to it repeatedly since the war's end. The sociologist Emiko Onyuki Tierney, whose work on the diaries and letters of student conscripts who became kamikaze pilots is among the most cited in the academic literature, has argued that these men, many of them university students with backgrounds in philosophy, literature, and the humanities, brought a reflective intelligence to their situation that makes their private writings some of the most philosophically complex documents of the entire war. Many of them wrote about the contradiction between their individual consciousness, their sense of themselves as thinking, feeling, experiencing beings, and the demand that this consciousness be surrendered to a collective purpose. They did not, in their private writing, resolve this contradiction cleanly. They lived in it and wrote from within it. And the result is a body of documentation that resists the simple heroic narrative and the simple victimhood narrative with equal force. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, the kamikaze had ceased to be a tactic and had become a strategic program, embedded in Japan's overall plan for resisting the anticipated American invasion of the home islands. Operation Ketsugo, the Japanese plan for the defense of Kyushu against invasion, assigned a central role to kamikaze attacks on the invasion fleet. Japanese planners estimated they would need between 5,000 and 10,000 aircraft for this operation, most of them to be used in suicide attacks, and they had already begun accumulating this reserve by the spring of 1945. Concealing aircraft in dispersed shelters, underground facilities, and camouflaged revetments across Kyushu and Honshu. The scale of this accumulation and the American intelligence assessment of what an invasion would cost in Allied casualties against this kind of defense was one of the factors that weighed on the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in August of 1945. The kamikaze program, in other words, had strategic implications that extended beyond the ships it struck. It shaped, at least in part, the decisions that ended the war. The program was not stopped by military defeat in the conventional sense. It was stopped by Japan's surrender on the 15th of August, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war. When the surrender came, there were still thousands of aircraft and thousands of trained pilots held in reserve across the home islands, waiting for an invasion that never came. Vice Admiral Onishi, who had started the program with 41 aircraft in a Manila airfield 10 months earlier, wrote a farewell letter before his own death and apologized to the spirits of the young men who had died. He wrote that he hoped Japan would find peace, and that the sacrifice of these men would not have been in vain. Whether that hope has been realized, whether Japan's post-war history can be understood as a redemption of that sacrifice, is a question that Japanese society has been negotiating, painfully and imperfectly, ever since. Chapter 9, Okinawa. The Floating Chrysanthemum and the Worst 90 Days. The island of Okinawa is roughly 112 kilometers long and between 11 and 32 kilometers wide at various points. A relatively modest piece of land, sitting roughly 600 kilometers from the Japanese home island of Kyushu. In the spring of 1945, it became the site of the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War and the most concentrated and sustained kamikaze assault ever conducted. The numbers from the Okinawa campaign are, even at this distance of more than 8 decades, genuinely difficult to absorb. More than 12,000 American military personnel were killed. Japanese military casualties numbered more than 100,000. Okinawan civilian dead an aspect of the battle that received insufficient attention for decades. Numbered between 40,000 and 150,000, a range that reflects the genuine uncertainty in the historical record and the appalling reality that much of the civilian population was caught between the two military forces. The American invasion, Operation Iceberg, began on the 1st of April, 1945, Easter Sunday. More than 500,000 Allied troops and a fleet of approximately 1,500 ships assembled for the operation, the largest amphibious force committed in the Pacific War and one of the largest in history. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious force. The naval presence off Okinawa represented an extraordinary concentration of Allied sea power, and for the Japanese High Command, it represented both the threat and the opportunity. The threat was existential. Okinawa, if taken, would serve as the staging base for an invasion of the home islands. The opportunity was that so many Allied ships, concentrated in a relatively small sea area for a prolonged period, represented a target of a scale that the kamikaze program had been built precisely to attack. Operation Kikusui, the systematic mass kamikaze raids, began on the 6th of April, 1945, just 5 days after the initial landings. The first raid, Kikusui No. 1, committed 230 kamikaze aircraft alongside 225 conventional attack aircraft in a single day's operations. The scale of this assault overwhelmed the combat air patrol capability in specific sectors. Ships were hit throughout the day. The destroyer USS Bush was struck by 3 kamikaze aircraft in rapid succession and sank. USS Colhoun was hit and sank the same day. 6 more destroyers were damaged. The fast battleship USS Maryland was hit. The combination of conventional attack and kamikaze attack in the same raid forced the defending fighters to manage multiple threat types simultaneously and created specific windows, during which some kamikazes reached the inner screening line around the carriers. The radar picket destroyers bore a disproportionate share of the suffering at Okinawa, positioned on 16 radar picket stations around the approaches to the island, designated by number, with the most dangerous stations on the northern and northwestern approaches. These ships were the first targets encountered by incoming Japanese aircraft. Kamikaze pilots quickly learned to identify the destroyers on the picket stations and increasingly directed their attacks specifically at these ships, both to eliminate the early warning capability and because the destroyers were legitimate, significant targets. The experience of the men who served on these picket stations has been the subject of dedicated historical examination. And what those examinations reveal is an operational environment of sustained, cumulative horror. Sailors on the picket stations described days in which attacks came in near continuous waves, beginning before dawn and continuing through the day, with brief pauses that provided insufficient time to recover the dead or repair critical systems before the next wave arrived. USS Laffey on the 16th of April, 1945, is the engagement that has attracted the most extensive subsequent documentation from the Okinawa picket operations. She was attacked by approximately 22 aircraft in a period of approximately 79 minutes, a sustained assault that resulted in 4 kamikaze hits, 4 bomb hits, and numerous near misses. 32 of her crew were killed, and 71 were wounded. The ship remained afloat due to the extraordinary damage control effort of her surviving crew, and was eventually towed to safety. Laffey's survival, the result of trained men performing extraordinary work under conditions that had no precedent in naval warfare, became one of the emblematic stories of the Okinawa campaign. She has been preserved as a museum ship, and the damage she sustained and survived is a physical record of what the radar picket stations endured. The sea battle off Okinawa also witnessed one of the most operationally significant surface actions of the entire Pacific War, one that is intimately connected to the kamikaze story. On the 6th and 7th of April, as the first Kikusui raid was striking the Allied fleet, the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built, was dispatched on a one-way mission to Okinawa with enough fuel only to reach the island, there to beach herself and fight as a fixed-shore battery until destroyed. This was, in a very real sense, a surface ship application of the same logic that underpinned the kamikaze program. The asset was going to be lost regardless, and using it offensively was preferable to surrendering it passively. American carrier aircraft located Yamato and her small escort force in the East China Sea on the 7th of April. She was struck by approximately 10 torpedoes and 5 bombs before a magazine explosion destroyed her. More than 2,400 of her crew died with her. The loss of Yamato, the physical embodiment of Japan's naval power, the ship that represented the pre-war doctrine of decisive surface engagement, on a mission that bore so close a structural resemblance to the kamikaze philosophy, is one of the most striking symbolic moments in the entire Pacific War. The 10 Kikusui raids at Okinawa stretched across the period from the 6th of April to the 22nd of June. Between them, they committed roughly 1,465 kamikaze sorties. The individual raids varied in scale and effectiveness depending on weather, the state of the defending combat air patrol, and the specific mix of aircraft committed. The Americans became progressively better at managing the raids as the campaign continued. Fighter direction improved. The radar picket stations became more experienced in coordinating their own air defense, and anti-aircraft gunnery crews developed specific techniques against the kamikaze approach patterns. Yet even against an increasingly competent defense, the sheer volume of the attacks ensured that ships continued to be struck. By the end of the Okinawa campaign in late June of 1945, the kamikaze had sunk or put out of action more American ships than any other weapon or tactic deployed by Japan during the Pacific War. 34 ships were sunk in total across the entire Pacific campaign. More than 300 were damaged, and the human cost: nearly 5,000 American sailors dead, nearly 5,000 wounded, was the highest suffered by the United States Navy in a single theater operation of the war. The scale of these casualties informed American military planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands in a very direct way. If defending Okinawa had cost this much, and if Japan had already demonstrated its willingness to spend human lives at a rate, and in a manner that conventional military planning struggled to account for, then the projected cost of Operation Downfall, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November of 1945, was a figure that American military planners found deeply alarming, regardless of which specific estimate they were working from. The landscape of Okinawa today contains memorials to all of the dead from the campaign: American, Japanese military, and Okinawan civilian. The Peace Memorial Park at the island's southern tip includes the Cornerstone of Peace, on which the names of more than 240,000 people who died in the battle are inscribed. This includes the names of every nationality represented in the fighting, in a deliberately non-hierarchical arrangement that is itself a statement about how Okinawa has chosen to remember the battle. It is a statement that military history, and the kamikaze story within it, does not always make easily, that the dead are the dead, that the numbers in historical analysis represent individual losses, and that the people behind those numbers existed in a way that the numbers themselves do not convey. Chapter 10. The Culture of Departure, Ceremonies, Letters, and the Last Days Before a Mission. There is a specific form of historical evidence that makes the kamikaze story different from almost any other episode in the Second World War. The sheer volume of personal documentation left behind by the men who flew these missions, letters, diaries, poems, photographs, personal objects, is extraordinary. This happened for reasons that are not difficult to understand. Men who know they are going to die have both the motivation and, in many cases, the time to write. The Japanese military did not consistently prevent pilots from writing before their missions, at least in the earlier phases of the program, and the result is an archive of private testimony that constitutes one of the most remarkable primary source collections from any conflict in modern history. The ceremonies that preceded kamikaze missions were organized, deliberate, and imbued with cultural meaning at every level. The night before a mission, pilots typically gathered for a farewell dinner. Sake was served. Commanding officers addressed the unit. The food was chosen with care. White rice was a luxury item in 1945 Japan, and providing it was a statement of respect. Songs were sung, often traditional military songs or folk songs from the pilots' home regions. Some accounts describe laughter and apparent lightness. Others describe silence and tears, sometimes from officers who were sending men they had trained personally on missions from which they would not return. Both types of account are genuine, and both are documented. The range of human response to the prospect of death in the immediate, known future was as wide as one might expect it to be among a large group of young men. The ritual cup of sake held in both hands, turned 3 times before drinking, was one of the most consistently described ceremonial elements across accounts from different units and different times in the program. The gesture was drawn from Shinto ritual tradition and from the broader ceremonial vocabulary of Japanese military culture. The wearing of the hachimaki, a headband, often white, sometimes bearing a rising sun motif or a handwritten personal inscription, was another near universal element. White is the color of death in Japanese tradition, and the white headband placed a pilot within an aesthetic and cultural framework that connected his mission to a long tradition of martial sacrifice in Japanese history. Many pilots also wore a senimbari, a cloth belt to which 1,000 women had each sewn 1 stitch, a traditional talisman given to soldiers by families and communities. The senimbari's presence on a man preparing for a deliberate death is a detail that historians of Japanese culture have found particularly resonant. The persistence of the protective talisman, even when there was no protection to be had. The letters left behind cover an enormous range of emotional register. Some are formal to the point of emotional austerity, statements of duty, expressions of loyalty to the emperor and to Japan. Request us parents to accept the news of death without excessive grief. Others are intimate and specific in ways that are deeply moving at this distance. Descriptions of specific memories, requests for particular family members to be told particular things, apologies for not having been a better son or brother, expressions of love that the writer knew could never be reciprocated in the form he would have wished. Midshipman Ichizo Hayashi, who flew a mission in April of 1945, wrote to his mother, "I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a member of the Special Attack Force. I shall move briskly to the attack, feeling that I am your true son and Japanese." But he also wrote in the same letter, "I would like to hold your hand once more." These 2 registers, the formal and the intimate duty and longing, existing in the same document, written by the same hand, are the heart of what makes the kamikaze pilot's letters such difficult and important historical testimony. Yasuzo Ikijima, a student pilot who died in the Okinawa campaign, left a diary that was studied in post-war research, and that illustrates a different kind of private response. His entries show a gradual movement not toward enthusiasm, but toward a kind of resignation that he characterized in his own words as clarity. He wrote about the world he was leaving, the books he had been reading, the university lectures he had attended before conscription, the philosophical ideas that occupied him. He wrote about his doubt that any of it had meaning given what was about to happen. He wrote, in one of his final entries, something that translates approximately as, "I shall not think anymore. To think is to suffer. I have thought enough for a lifetime." This is not the voice of a man dying for a glorious cause in a spirit of joyful sacrifice. It is the voice of a young man of intelligence and sensitivity who has been placed in an unbearable position and has found, as humans often do, a way to endure it that does not require resolving it. The practice of composing a death poem, a jizei in the Japanese tradition, a poem written at the moment of death or in anticipation of it, was encouraged and in many units formalized. The tradition of the death poem stretches back centuries in Japanese literary culture, associated particularly with Zen Buddhism and with the warrior class of the feudal period. In the kamikaze units, officers sometimes collected and preserved these poems, and a significant number have survived. They vary enormously in quality and emotional content. Some are genuinely accomplished small poems in the classical tradition. Some are conventional in their imagery and sentiment. And some are so simple and direct that they resist literary analysis entirely. A pilot who wrote only "Mother, I am going now" was not composing a literary artifact. He was saying goodbye in the only form available to him. The final morning's routine before a mission was described, with remarkable consistency across accounts from different pilots, different units, and different times in the campaign. Men woke early, before dawn in most accounts. There was breakfast. Gear was checked and prepared. The aircraft was inspected, the bomb confirmed and armed, the fuel loaded. In the photographs that survive from this period, taken by Japanese military photographers, now held in various archives, the faces of the men gathered on the airfield before departure are strikingly ordinary. They look young because they were young. They look tired. Some are smiling, some are not. None of them look like the images in the wartime propaganda posters, full of bright-eyed martial ardor. They look like what they were. Very young men, holding themselves together on a difficult morning. The takeoff was the final act of individual agency available to a kamikaze pilot, the last moment in which he was doing something that any pilot does, something routine and technically demanding and real. Witnesses who watched the departing aircraft described the pilots performing the ritual of dipping their wings as they flew low over the airfield for the final time. A farewell gesture, the wing dip being both a pilot's greeting and the only physical expression of goodbye available at speed and altitude. Ground crews who had maintained the aircraft, who had in many cases known the pilots personally through training, lined the runway and watched until the aircraft were out of sight. Many accounts describe these maintenance men, who would survive the war, as the ones most visibly overcome with grief at these departures. The pilots, by the time of takeoff, had often achieved a state of composure that the ground crews left behind had not. There is a museum in Chiran, on the southern tip of Kyushu in Kagoshima Prefecture, called the Chiran Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots. It preserves photographs, letters, diaries, and personal effects of pilots who departed from Chiran Airfield on their final missions. It is visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually, overwhelmingly Japanese, and it is one of the most emotionally affecting museums from the Second World War anywhere in the world. The question of how Chiran, and Japan more broadly, contextualizes what is preserved there, whether as sacrifice, as tragedy, as warning, as honor, or as some combination of all of these that shifts depending on who is asking and what they need from the past, is a question that Japanese society has not definitively answered in the 8 decades since the war ended. That unresolved quality is itself historically significant. The kamikaze is not finished history in Japan. It is still, in important ways, live history, connected to ongoing arguments about war memory, national identity, and the relationship between the dead and the living. Chapter 11, The Ship That Would Not Die. Stories of survival from the receiving end. Every account of the kamikaze campaign includes the perspective of those who launched the attacks. It is less common to find sustained examination of what the experience was like from the other side, from the decks of the ships that were hit, from the men who were fighting fires below decks while the air battle continued above, from the officers who had to make immediate decisions with incomplete information and limited resources in the moments after impact. This chapter belongs to those men. USS Bunker Hill, struck by two kamikaze aircraft on the 11th of May, 1945, was one of the largest and most powerful fleet carriers in the Pacific Fleet. She was the flagship of Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell and was conducting active flight operations when the attacks came. The first aircraft struck the flight deck at the base of the island structure, with the bomb exploding below the deck in the gallery walkway area. Approximately 30 seconds later, a second aircraft struck the aft flight deck. The two impacts, in close succession with the flight deck crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, created a catastrophic fire situation. 389 of her crew were killed. 264 were wounded. Admiral Mitchell transferred his flag to USS Enterprise. Bunker Hill survived and returned to the United States, but she never fought again. The combination of the two near-simultaneous strikes and the fire that followed had damaged her so extensively that repair and return to the Pacific before the war's end was not possible. The accounts of the men who fought the fires on Bunker Hill that afternoon constitute some of the most visceral documentation of damage control under kamikaze attack available in the historical record. Survivor accounts describe the difficulty of the smoke below decks, so thick that men navigated by touch through passageways they had memorized during training, unable to see the person standing next to them. They described the heat building through the ship's structural members. They described the difficulty of knowing where to go and what to do when the ship's normal communication systems had been destroyed, and the command structure was reorganized under fire in real time by whoever was alive and in the right position to take charge. What kept Bunker Hill afloat was not a single heroic act. It was the accumulated competence of hundreds of men performing their specific trained roles under conditions that exceeded anything the training had prepared them for. USS Franklin represents a different kind of survival story, one that took place earlier, in March of 1945, and that involved a conventional dive bomb attack, rather than a kamikaze hit, but which is so instructive in terms of damage control under catastrophic aircraft-related damage that it belongs in any serious examination of this campaign. A single Japanese dive bomber caught Franklin on the 19th of March, 1945, while she was operating closer to the Japanese home islands than any other carrier had been in the war. 2 bombs struck her while her flight deck was crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, creating fires and explosions that continued for hours. 807 of her crew were killed, the second highest single ship casualty count for any American warship in the entire war. And yet, through the extraordinary damage control effort, led by her commanding officer, Captain Leslie Gares, and critically by her executive officer, Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, a Catholic chaplain who led sailors through the smoke and fire, organizing damage control parties in actions that earned him the Medal of Honor. Franklin was saved. She made port in New York under her own power. She never fought again, but she lived. The destroyers on the radar picket stations accumulated the most sustained and numerically greatest casualty record of the Okinawa campaign. USS Manor L. Abele was struck by an Oka rocket bomb on the 12th of April, 1945. The first ship sunk by the Oka in combat. The Oka was released from its parent aircraft at altitude, glided toward the target, and in the final phase of approach, the pilot ignited the solid fuel rockets, achieving a terminal speed that no fighter intercept and no anti-aircraft fire then available could reliably stop. The Abel was struck amidships and broke in two. 73 of her crew were killed. The loss of the Abele to an Oka was the confirmation, feared since the Oka's existence had become known to American intelligence, that Japan had produced a weapon in this specific category that the existing defense systems were inadequate to stop consistently. The psychological experience of being under sustained kamikaze attack over a period of weeks, as the crews of the radar picket destroyers were, has been studied by historians and by naval medical researchers who gathered testimony from survivors both during and after the war. The accounts that emerge describe a specific pattern: initial heightened alertness and a belief in personal survival, followed by a gradual shift in which fatalism and a form of dissociation became coping mechanisms. Men describe reaching a point at which they stopped calculating the odds of surviving and simply occupied the present moment of their duty, checking the radar, loading ammunition, watching the sky, because thinking beyond that moment had become too psychologically costly. This is a recognizable psychological adaptation to sustained mortal risk, documented in other contexts of prolonged combat. But the specific quality of the kamikaze threat, the knowledge that the aircraft bearing down on the ship was not going to turn away, gave it a particular intensity that survivors' accounts consistently emphasize. There were moments of what could only be called absurdity within the horror, moments that survivors sometimes included in their accounts, because they were true, and because truth sometimes produces incongruous juxtapositions that no fictional account would dare invent. A mess cook who had been below decks preparing the evening meal, who emerged through a hatch into a burning flight deck, still carrying a tray. A bosun's mate who repaired a critical piece of communications equipment under fire, using a tool that was not the correct one, holding the mechanism together by hand, while a shipmate used him as a workbench. These small human details appear in oral histories and in the written accounts that veterans produced in the decades after the war. And they do something that the statistics and the damage assessments cannot do. They insist on the specific, contingent, human reality of what happened aboard these ships. The British carriers of Task Force 57 operated under similar sustained attack pressure during the Okinawa campaign. HMS Formidable, HMS Victorious, and HMS Indomitable were all struck by kamikaze aircraft during the campaign. The armoured deck advantage was real. As already noted, British carriers resumed operations within hours of hits that would have incapacitated American wooden-decked carriers for months. But this did not mean the British carriers were immune to damage or casualty. The fires that resulted from a burning kamikaze aircraft, even one that had not penetrated the armoured deck, were dangerous and required intensive damage control effort. And the psychological experience of being struck, the noise, the shock, the sudden shift from routine to emergency, was not mitigated by armour. British survivor accounts from the Okinawa campaign share the same core qualities as American ones. The initial shock, the transition to trained response, the exhaustion of hours of damage control, and the subsequent arrival of something resembling relief that the ship had held. The men who survived kamikaze strikes and returned to their ship's duties, sometimes within hours, sometimes after weeks of medical treatment, described in their post-war accounts a specific difficulty in explaining to people who had not been there what the experience had felt like. The standard vocabulary of combat experience, the noise, the confusion, the fear, was available and was used. But beneath that vocabulary was something harder to express: the difficulty of processing an attack by an adversary who had made a specific, deliberate choice to die in order to destroy your ship. The ordinary ethical framework of combat, in which both sides are trying to survive, and in which taking life is regrettable but explicable within the logic of self-preservation, did not straightforwardly apply. Survivors sometimes described feeling underneath the fear and the response training a kind of bewilderment, not at the fact of being attacked, but at the specific nature of the attack. That bewilderment, expressed carefully and honestly in the best of the survivor accounts, is part of what makes this history different from most. The ships that survived kamikaze strikes during the Pacific War's final year, and there were hundreds of them, many returning to operations after repairs, are the other side of the statistical account. The roughly 19% hit rate means that for every kamikaze aircraft that struck a ship, approximately 4 were destroyed without hitting their targets. Each of those near misses had a crew who watched an aircraft come at them and saw it deflected by a Hellcat, by an anti-aircraft round, by the pilot's aim being off by a few degrees at the critical moment. Those men, too, are part of this story. Their survival was not guaranteed. It was the product of preparation, technology, training, luck, and the accumulated institutional learning of a Navy that had been fighting this specific problem for 7 months and had refused to stop getting better at it. Chapter 12, The Last Thunder. Operation Ketsugo and the Invasion That Never Came. In the summer of 1945, in underground command bunkers and in carefully camouflaged aircraft shelters across the island of Kyushu, Japan was preparing for the last and largest act of the kamikaze campaign. It was a campaign that was never launched. The invasion it was designed to meet never came, but the preparations for it, the scale of aircraft accumulated, the doctrine developed, the infrastructure built, the pilots trained and waiting, were real, documented, and of considerable historical significance. They shaped the decisions made in Washington and at the highest levels of Allied command in ways that reverberated far beyond the Pacific theater. Operation Ketsugo, decisive operation, was the Japanese plan for the defense of the home islands against the anticipated American invasion. It was not a single plan, but a series of numbered plans for different sectors. Ketsugo number 1 through number 6 covered the major islands and the most likely invasion approaches. Ketsugo number 6, covering Kyushu, was the one that received the most preparation, because American operational planning, specifically Operation Downfall, divided into Operation Olympic for Kyushu and Operation Coronet for Honshu, had identified Kyushu as the first invasion target, scheduled for the 1st of November, 1945. Japanese military intelligence had made the same assessment. The geography of the Pacific, the availability of bases, the operational logic of the Allied advance, all of it pointed to Kyushu. Both sides knew where the next battle was going to be. The kamikaze component of Ketsugo was assigned a central, decisive role. Japanese planners believed, based on the lessons of the Okinawa campaign, where the kamikaze had imposed extraordinary costs on the Allied fleet, that a sufficiently massive and sustained kamikaze effort against the invasion fleet could inflict enough damage to make the invasion operationally untenable, or at minimum to degrade the invasion capability so severely that the cost would compel a negotiated end to the war on terms Japan could accept. This was not a hope or a wish. It was a specific operational theory, supported by calculations derived from the Okinawa data. If the kamikaze had hit approximately 1 in 5 of the aircraft it committed at Okinawa, and if the invasion fleet was far larger than the Okinawa fleet, then committing far more aircraft to the kamikaze assault might produce far more hits. Enough hits to sink transports, to destroy the logistical infrastructure of the invasion, to make the landing force's position on the beaches untenable. The aircraft accumulation for Ketsugo had been underway since the spring of 1945. By the time of Japan's surrender, American intelligence assessments estimated, and post-war investigations of Japanese military records largely confirmed, that Japan had accumulated between 5,500 and 10,000 aircraft of all types for the defense of the home islands, the majority of which were intended for suicide attack missions. These aircraft were dispersed in small lots at numerous airfields and in concealed sites, partly to protect them from American air attack, and partly because the doctrine of Ketsugo specifically called for holding the kamikaze force in reserve until the invasion fleet was committed and could not withdraw. The plan was not to use the aircraft against preliminary air attacks or against the naval forces standing off the coast. It was to commit them in maximum concentration at the moment the invasion fleet was most vulnerable, when it was disgorging troops and supplies, when ships were slowed and maneuvering in the confined waters close to shore, when the air defense system was under maximum pressure from multiple competing demands. American intelligence was tracking the aircraft accumulation through aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, and the numbers were alarming. The intelligence estimates fed into the planning process for Operation Olympic produced casualty projections that ranged enormously, from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of American killed and wounded. And the range itself reflected deep uncertainty about how effective the kamikaze assault on the invasion fleet would prove under conditions of maximum Japanese commitment. The Okinawa experience was the primary data point, and the Okinawa experience suggested that the kamikaze, in sufficient numbers against a concentrated naval force, could impose costs that conventional military planning struggled to absorb. This was the intelligence picture available to the American military and political leadership in the summer of 1945, when decisions were being made about how to end the war. The moral and historical debate about those decisions, about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945, is one of the most sustained and complex in the entire historiography of the Second World War, and it is not one that this documentary will attempt to resolve. What can be stated clearly is that the kamikaze campaign, the existing evidence of what it had already cost at Okinawa, and the projected evidence of what it would cost at Kyushu, was a real and substantial element of the decision-making context. Whether it was the decisive element, whether the atomic bombings were necessary to avoid the invasion, whether the invasion would have been undertaken, whether Japan's domestic political situation was already moving towards surrender without it. These questions have been argued by serious historians for 8 decades and will continue to be argued. But the kamikaze is not absent from that argument. It is present in it as a causal factor of genuine weight. Japan's surrender on the 15th of August, 1945, following the Emperor's radio broadcast. The first time most Japanese subjects had ever heard his voice, had a specific effect on the men who had been trained and were waiting at the kamikaze bases on Kyushu and elsewhere. The accounts of pilots who survived the war and wrote about this moment describe a range of reactions as wide as any other moment in this story. Some describe relief so overwhelming that it surprised them, which is perhaps its own testimony about what they had been carrying. Some describe a void, the absence of the purpose that had structured their existence for months, without anything immediately available to replace it. Some describe anger, directed at the leadership that had built the program and then accepted surrender. And some describe something more quietly complicated, a gradual, difficult recalibration toward a future they had been certain they would not have. Vice Admiral Onishi's own end came on the night of the 15th of August, the same night the surrender was announced. He committed ritual suicide, seppuku, writing in his final letter that he wished to apologize to the spirits of the young men who had died at his order, and to beg their forgiveness. He wrote that their sacrifice should become the foundation of Japan's future, and he asked that young Japanese in peacetime work to build a worthy nation from what their generation's dead had left behind. He did not die quickly. The accounts indicate that he lived through the night, declining medical assistance, and died in the early morning of the 16th. Whether this extended death was intended as an extended penance is something this historical record cannot confirm with certainty. But it is something that Japanese accounts of Onishi have returned to repeatedly. It is a difficult and human ending to the story of the man most responsible for the program. Neither simple heroism nor simple villainy, but something more ambiguous and more real than either. The kamikaze aircraft and equipment that remained were destroyed in accordance with the surrender terms. The airfields and underground shelters were surrendered to Allied occupation forces. The pilots who had been waiting, who had prepared themselves, who had said their internal goodbyes, who had been living in the specific psychological space of men, who expected to die on a specific mission on a specific day, began the process of reintegration into a Japan that was itself in the process of becoming something entirely different from what it had been. This process was not straightforward for anyone involved. The country they returned to was occupied, physically damaged, its infrastructure damaged or destroyed, its institutional frameworks dismantling under Allied occupation direction. The men who had trained to die for this country now had to learn to live in it, in a new form they had not chosen and had not expected. Some of these men have written memoirs, and some have spoken publicly about their experience in the decades since the war. Their accounts have contributed significantly to the historiographical understanding of what the kamikaze program meant from the inside, what the selection process felt like, what the training was like, what the waiting felt like. Some have been explicit about their relief at surviving. Some have been explicit about the complexity of that relief. The guilt of being alive when their classmates were not. The difficulty of reconciling survival with the framework of meaning they had been given for their deaths. These accounts, the memoirs of the survivors, the men for whom the invasion never came and the mission was never flown, are among the most quietly devastating documents in the entire literature of the Pacific War. They are the testimony of people who prepared completely for death and then had to reconstruct, from nothing, a relationship with the future. The Chiran Peace Museum, the memorials at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, and the broader landscape of Japanese war memory have engaged with the kamikaze story in ways that have evolved substantially since the 1950s. In the immediate post-war years, public discussion of the kamikazes was suppressed or heavily managed. First, by Allied occupation censorship, which restricted content deemed to glorify Japanese militarism, and then by the complex social dynamics of a society simultaneously processing defeat, occupation, and a radical transformation of its political institutions. The men who had been kamikaze pilots, those who had trained and waited and not been sent, found themselves in a country that was not yet ready to discuss openly what had been done in its name, or what had been asked of them. The gradual emergence of kamikaze testimony into the Japanese public sphere from the 1960s onward was uneven and contested. Nationalist narratives that emphasized the nobility and voluntary nature of the sacrifice competed with more critical accounts that emphasized coercion, institutional pressure, and the waste of young lives in a losing cause. Academic historians, working from the documentary record of letters and diaries, occupied a middle ground that attempted to hold the complexity of the evidence rather than resolve it into either frame. This is still, in broad terms, the state of the historiographical debate, a debate that is more active in Japan than it is in the English language literature, and that connects to live political arguments about war memory, pacifism, and the appropriate understanding of Japan's military past. For the Allied survivors, the sailors who had served on the picket destroyers and the carriers, the fighter pilots who had flown interception missions, the damage control crews who had fought fires. The post-war process of integrating the kamikaze experience into memory was equally complex. In entirely different ways, many of these men, particularly those who had served on the radar picket stations, returned home to a country celebrating victory and not particularly interested in the specific texture of what they had endured. The Pacific War in American public memory was for decades primarily framed around its beginning at Pearl Harbor and its ending at Tokyo Bay. The long middle, including the radar picket stations, the burning carriers, the 79 minutes of sustained attack on USS Laffey, occupied a less prominent space in the national narrative than the men who had been there believed it deserved. Veterans organizations specifically for radar picket station survivors were formed in the post-war decades, and the advocacy of these organizations for recognition of the specific nature of their service and for the accurate recording of their casualties in the official history has been part of the process by which the full account of the Okinawa campaign has gradually been assembled. The specific casualty figures, the specific ship histories, the specific after-action accounts that make the Okinawa chapter of this documentary possible owe a substantial debt to the work of these veterans and the historians who collaborated with them in preserving the record before the witnesses were gone. That record is now almost entirely in the hands of the documents, the ship's logs, and the institutional archives. The last of the men who were there are very old, and most are gone. The story of the kamikaze, from its origins in the desperate strategic arithmetic of 1944, through the first missions at Leyte Gulf, through the industrial scale of the Okinawa campaign, to the waiting aircraft on Kyushu that were never used, is, in the end, a story about what human institutions do to human beings under extreme pressure. It is a story about how military organizations take individual people, shape them toward institutional purposes, and ask of them things that peace would make unthinkable. It is a story about the specific cultural and historical context that made one particular form of this shaping possible in one particular time and place. And it is a story about the people on the receiving end, the men on the ships, the fighter pilots in the air, who had to respond to something their training had partially, but not entirely, prepared them for. What it is not is a simple story. Not a story of serene, willing sacrifice on one side and helpless victimhood on the other. Not a story that cleanly separates the perpetrators from the victims, the willing from the coerced, the heroic from the tragic. The historical record, examined honestly, produces a picture that is far more complicated than any of those frames. A picture in which the same young man can be simultaneously a product of institutional coercion and a person of genuine conviction, in which the same tactic can be simultaneously an act of military desperation and a strategically coherent response to specific circumstances, in which the same campaign can be simultaneously the most psychologically effective weapon Japan deployed in the Pacific War and a fundamental contributor to the decisions that brought the war to its terrible conclusion. We are heading now into the final 3 chapters of this documentary. Chapter 13 will examine the legacy of the kamikaze in post-war military thought, what navies learned, how carrier design changed, how the strategic implications of human-guided weapons were absorbed into Cold War doctrine. Chapter 14 will examine the memory of the kamikaze in Japan and in the West, the museums, the memorials, the political arguments, and the ongoing process of historical reckoning. And Chapter 15 will draw everything together into a final accounting. Not a verdict, because history does not issue verdicts, but a reckoning with what we are left with when we have looked at this story as honestly as it deserves. If you have stayed with this documentary through 12 chapters, through the origins of Japanese naval aviation, through the catastrophe of the Marianas, through the first missions and the great campaigns, through the personal testimony of the men who flew and the men who were struck. Thank you. This kind of history matters precisely because it does not resolve easily. It matters because the people in it were real, and the events were real, and the distance of 80 years has not made them simple. Stay with us for the final 3 chapters. The story is not finished yet. Chapter 13. What the Navy's learned. Carrier design, doctrine, and the Cold War. Shadow every major war in the industrial age has left a technical inheritance, a body of engineering knowledge, tactical doctrine, and institutional learning that passes forward into the peacetime that follows. The Pacific War's kamikaze campaign left a particularly rich and contested inheritance, one that shaped naval architecture, fleet doctrine, and the theoretical framework for dealing with guided weapons for decades after the last Japanese aircraft was grounded in August of 1945. Understanding what the navies took from this experience, what they consciously absorbed, and what they struggled to translate into peacetime institutional form, is essential to understanding the full historical weight of the kamikaze story. The most immediately visible legacy was in carrier design. The contrast between the armoured British flight decks and the wooden American decks had been demonstrated under combat conditions with a clarity that no peacetime argument could have achieved. When the Royal Navy's carriers resumed flight operations within hours of kamikaze hits that would have put American carriers out of action for months, that data point entered the institutional memory of naval architecture at the highest possible level of authority. The authority of ships that had been struck and had survived because of specific design choices. The United States Navy's post-war carrier design program incorporated armored flight decks, beginning with the Midway class, which was still under construction at the war's end, and which entered service in the post-war period with structural characteristics that reflected the kamikaze experience. The general direction of American carrier design from the 1940s onward moved consistently toward greater structural resilience, a direction that owes a direct and traceable debt to the specific lessons of the Pacific War's final year. Anti-aircraft weapons development accelerated on the basis of Okinawa's lessons in ways that shaped naval gunnery through the 1950s and into the guided missile era. The proximity fuse, whose effectiveness had been dramatically demonstrated in the Pacific, became standard in American naval anti-aircraft ammunition across all calibers where it was practical to incorporate it. The 4-centimeter Bofors gun, which had proven its close-range effectiveness against kamikaze aircraft, remained the backbone of naval close-range air defense for a decade after the war. But the deeper lesson, that a weapon guided to its target by a human operator inside the weapon itself, and therefore capable of adjusting to defensive maneuver throughout its entire flight, was categorically different from an unguided bomb or an aerial torpedo, was a lesson that pointed in a direction the existing gun technology could only partially address. The logical endpoint of the kamikaze's tactical concept was not the manned aircraft. It was the guided missile. The German Ruhrstahl SD-1400, better known as the Fritz X, had already demonstrated in the Mediterranean in 1943 that a radio-guided bomb could hit a moving ship with a precision that unguided weapons could not match. German engineers had also produced the Henschel H-293, a rocket-powered guided glide bomb that sank and damaged a number of Allied vessels before countermeasures were developed. The Japanese Oka represented a parallel development in the same direction, a weapon guided to its target with human precision at speeds that defensive systems of the period could not reliably intercept. American, British, and Soviet engineers, emerging from the Second World War with access to all of this data, were looking at the same conclusion from multiple angles. The future of naval warfare would be defined by the guided weapon and the guided weapon's defining characteristic, the ability to steer toward a maneuvering target throughout its flight path, was precisely what made the kamikaze so difficult to stop and the Oka so dangerous in its terminal phase. The United States Navy's post-war investment in surface-to-air missile development, producing the Terrier, Talos, and Tartar systems that would equip American warships through the 1950s and 60s, was driven in part by the explicit recognition that gun-based anti-aircraft systems could not reliably stop a target approaching at the speeds and from the altitudes that jet-powered equivalents of the Oka would be capable of. The threat model that shaped early Cold War American naval air defense doctrine was not purely hypothetical. It was built in very direct ways, from the experience of watching Oka rocket bombs sink destroyers in the spring of 1945. Soviet engineers, working in the post-war period on their own anti-ship weapons, produced cruise missiles that American naval planners specifically characterized in internal briefings and strategic assessments from the 1950s as the Soviet answer to the kamikaze problem. How do you deliver a large warhead to a well-defended ship at speeds and from attack vectors that the ship's defenses cannot reliably handle? The answer, in both the Japanese and the Soviet cases, was guided propulsion and a terminal approach that denied the defense adequate reaction time. The tactical doctrine of fleet air defense also evolved in direct response to the Okinawa experience. The layered defense concept, fighters at the outer perimeter, radar pickets providing early warning on the approaches, medium-range guns in the mid-layer, automatic close-range weapons in the inner layer, and damage control as the final line, became standard doctrine for American carrier battle group operations in the post-war period, codified in fleet publications and taught in staff colleges. The specific geometry of the radar picket station arrangement, the placement of warning ships far enough out from the main body to give meaningful intercept time, while accepting that these ships would be exposed to concentrated attack, was refined and adjusted in light of the picket destroyer's casualties at Okinawa. But the fundamental concept was retained because the alternatives were worse. The language and the specific procedures changed as the technology changed. Radar improved dramatically, jet fighters flew faster and at greater range, missiles replaced guns in the outer layers. But the underlying doctrine retained the bones of what had been worked out under fire in the waters off Okinawa in the spring of 1945. The psychological dimension of the kamikaze experience left a less formalized but equally real institutional inheritance. Naval medical researchers who had studied the stress responses of radar picket station crews produced reports in the immediate post-war period that contributed to the developing field of combat psychiatry and to the Navy's institutional thinking about crew rotation, rest, and the management of sustained operational stress. The specific problem of psychological response to an adversary who has removed self-preservation from the tactical equation. The bewilderment and the particular quality of fear described by so many Okinawa campaign survivors was noted in these reports as a distinct category that required specific institutional attention. How much this informed subsequent Cold War planning for nuclear deterrence, in which both sides were also, in a sense, dealing with the possibility of an adversary who had made calculations that removed individual survival from the equation, is a connection that historians of strategic thought have occasionally drawn but rarely developed at length. It is a thread worth noting, even if it resists simple resolution. The intelligence dimension of the kamikaze campaign also left a lasting inheritance. The discovery of the Yotka program, the American intelligence community's process of identifying and characterizing a weapon specifically engineered for human-guided suicide attack, required analytical frameworks that did not straightforwardly exist in the pre-war intelligence toolkit. The assumption that weapons had operators who would attempt to survive their use, and whose survival created specific vulnerabilities, targeting behavior, evasion, limits on approach angle, did not apply to the OCA or to the late war kamikaze program generally. Developing new analytical frameworks for weapons whose operators had no survival incentive was a genuine intelligence challenge that the Pacific War forced the Americans to address in real time. The methodological lessons from this challenge. How do you anticipate the capabilities of a weapon system whose use parameters are defined by the operator's willingness to die, were carried forward into Cold War intelligence assessment in ways that shaped how analysts thought about adversary intentions, capabilities, and the relationship between ideology and military behavior. Naval historians studying the post-war period have repeatedly noted that the full institutional absorption of the kamikaze's lessons was incomplete in important ways. The speed of post-war demobilization, the rapid shift in strategic focus to the nuclear deterrence framework of the Cold War, and the institutional pressure to move forward rather than to dwell on the specific tactical lessons of a concluded campaign, all contributed to a situation in which some of the most important learning from the Pacific War's final year was incompletely codified. Some of it was relearned at considerable cost in subsequent conflicts. The Falklands War of 1982, in which Argentine aircraft using air-launched anti-ship missiles sank 4 British warships and damaged many others, produced a renewed focus on the naval air defense lessons of 1945. The proximity fuse, the close-range automatic weapon, the layered defense, the psychological management of crews under sustained air attack, that the intervening 4 decades had allowed to atrophy in some respects. The specific weapons had changed, the problem had not. The technical legacy of the kamikaze is, in the end, a story about how military organizations process extreme experience into institutional knowledge, and about how imperfectly they do it, and how the imperfections have consequences. The specific men who fought through the Okinawa campaign carried the knowledge of what they had experienced. Some of them contributed that knowledge to the institutional record. Some of it was absorbed and acted on. Some of it was filed and forgotten until a subsequent conflict forced the same questions to be asked again. This pattern of hard-won knowledge, partially absorbed, partially lost, and partially recovered when the next crisis made it urgent, is one of the recurring themes of military history. And the kamikaze's post-war institutional legacy exemplifies it with particular clarity and at considerable cost. Chapter 14, Memory and Reckoning. How Japan and the West have carried this history. Every society that has been through a war must eventually decide what to do with its dead. Not the physical fact of the dead, but the meaning of them, the story that is told about why they died and what their dying was for. For Japan, the task of constructing a coherent national memory of the kamikaze campaign has been one of the most contested and emotionally charged elements of the broader, still unresolved process of reckoning with the Second World War. For the United States and its allies, the task has been simpler in some ways and more neglected in others. The Pacific War's kamikaze campaign, occupying a less prominent place in Western war memory than it deserves, given the scale of what it cost. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo is the most politically fraught site in Japan's landscape of war memory, and it is impossible to discuss the kamikaze's memorial afterlife without acknowledging it. Yasukuni enshrines the spirits of approximately 2,400,000 Japanese war dead, including, since 1978, the spirits of 14 Class A war criminals convicted by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. It enshrines kamikaze pilots, alongside all other categories of Japanese military dead, without hierarchical distinction. The Shrine's Associated Museum, the Yushukan, presents a version of the Pacific War's history that is contested by mainstream Japanese academic historians, and that has made the shrine deeply controversial in Japan's relationships with China and South Korea. When Japanese prime ministers visit the shrine, which some have done and others have deliberately avoided, the visits generate diplomatic incidents that are, in a real sense, incidents generated by unresolved arguments about how to remember what the kamikaze died for and whether what they died for deserves to be honored. The Chiron Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture occupies a different and in some ways more carefully constructed position in Japan's war memory landscape. Situated at the former Chiron airfield, from which hundreds of kamikaze pilots departed on their final missions, the museum's stated framing is explicitly that of peace rather than of military honor. Its central exhibit is the collection of letters and photographs left by pilots who flew from Chiron, presented in a context that emphasizes the youth of the men, their humanity, their family relationships, and the tragedy of their deaths, rather than the military ideology that sent them. Whether this framing successfully separates the human tragedy from the ideological context that produced it, whether you can mourn the individual without evaluating the system that killed him, is a question that visitors and critics of the museum have raised since its establishment. The museum's position is that the letters speak for themselves, and that what they say is primarily about love, loss, and the cost of war to the individuals who fight it. Japanese academic historians have generally been more insistent that the institutional context, the coercion, the ideology, the structural compulsion, must be part of the interpretive frame rather than a background that can be set aside in favor of the human stories alone. The figure of Vice Admiral Onishi remains contested in Japanese memory in ways that trace the deeper fault lines of the overall historical debate. He is remembered by some as a man who gave Japan's young pilots a form of meaning and agency in the face of defeat, who offered them a death that had purpose, rather than a death that had none. He is remembered by others as the architect of a system that sent teenagers to their deaths in service of a losing and morally compromised cause, and whose suicide was a gesture of self-absolution that could not retrospectively justify the choices he had made. The historical record, as we have examined it in detail across this documentary, does not cleanly support either reading. Onishi was intelligent, committed, genuinely distressed by what he had set in motion, and responsible for it in ways that cannot be dissolved by the tears he wept or the letter he left behind. Both things are simultaneously true. The difficulty of holding both things simultaneously is, perhaps, what makes his figure continue to attract argument. In the English language world, the popular memory of the kamikaze has been shaped heavily by the immediate post-war accounts of American naval officers, most of which emphasized the fanaticism of the attacks without deeply examining the human context of the men who carried them out. The term fanaticism, used consistently in American naval reports, memoirs, and post-war journalism, performs a specific ideological function. It places the kamikaze outside the universe of rational military behavior, and therefore outside the universe of political and moral analysis. If the pilots were simply fanatics, if their motivation was irrational religious or nationalist fervor, then the complex structural, cultural, and institutional account we have been building across this documentary is unnecessary. But the evidence, as the letters and the diaries and the post-war testimony of survivors demonstrate, does not support the fanaticism frame. It supports a more complicated account in which young men of diverse and often deeply ambivalent private feeling were placed within a system designed to extract a specific behavior from them, regardless of their private feeling. and in which the system largely succeeded. The academic literature on the kamikaze in English developed substantially from the 1990s onward, part driven by the translation of Japanese primary sources, and partly by a generation of historians who brought new methodological frameworks: social history, cultural history, the history of memory, to material that had previously been studied primarily through the lens of military operational history. The work of scholars like Emiko Onnuki Tierney, whose detailed examination of the private diaries of student pilots produced one of the most careful accounts of what it meant to be a young Japanese intellectual inside the kamikaze program, shifted the English language conversation significantly. It made visible the degree to which the pilots' private inner lives diverged from the public narrative that the Japanese military constructed around them. It also made visible the degree to which the official post-war American dismissal of those pilots as fanatics had performed its own kind of erasure, replacing complex human beings with a convenient category that served the purposes of the victor's narrative. The South Korean and Chinese dimensions of the memory debate are less often examined in Western accounts, but are substantial and important. Korean men served in the Imperial Japanese military during the Pacific War, some by conscription, some through a more complex process of assimilation and institutional pressure, and a small number died in kamikaze missions. The question of how to remember these men as Japanese military heroes, as Korean victims of Japanese colonialism, or as something that neither national narrative has an adequate category for, has been a live and contested question in South Korea for decades. The Yasukuni Shrine's enshrinement of Korean and Taiwanese war dead alongside Japanese dead, without the consent of those countries' governments, is one of the specific grievances that makes Yasukuni such a persistent source of diplomatic tension. These men's deaths were real. Their identities and the context of their service do not fit neatly into the Japanese national memory of the kamikaze, and forcing them to fit does those individuals a specific historical injustice. The Western popular culture representation of the kamikaze has gone through several distinct phases since the war. In the immediate post-war period, the kamikaze featured in American film and popular journalism, primarily as an exemplar of Japanese irrationality and the cultural distance between American and Japanese values. A representation that served specific ideological purposes in the context of post-war American-Japanese relations and the broader cultural work of making sense of the Pacific War. As the post-war period lengthened and American-Japanese relations became more complex, the popular representation shifted towards something more nuanced in serious historical accounts, while popular culture retained a simplified image for much longer. The video game representation of the kamikaze as a military tactic available to players of certain historical strategy games raises questions about the ethics and epistemology of historical simulation that fall somewhat outside this documentary's scope, but that are worth noting as evidence of how widely and in how many different contexts this historical episode continues to circulate in popular consciousness. The testimony of surviving kamikaze pilots, men who had been trained and assigned to missions, but who survived because the invasion never came, or because they were held in reserve, and then the war ended, has been collected systematically by Japanese oral historians and journalists since the 1980s, and these accounts have enriched the historical understanding of the program in ways that the written documents alone could not. The oral testimonies provide access to the experiential texture that letters, written in advance of death, could not fully capture. What the waiting felt like day after day, what it was like to know your mission and not yet fly it, how the men related to each other in the barracks and on the airfields in those final weeks. The survivors who have spoken on record are now very elderly. The youngest of them were teenagers in 1945 and are now in their 90s. And the window for primary oral testimony is closing, in the way that the windows for all first-hand accounts of the Second World War are closing. The urgency of collecting and preserving this testimony before it is lost entirely has been understood by Japanese oralists for some time, and the archives that have resulted from their work are among the most significant contributions to this specific area of history that the post-war period has produced. For the Allied veterans who experienced the kamikaze attacks, whose own memory and testimony is equally on the closing edge of direct human access, the reckoning with this history has taken forms that are perhaps less institutionally organized than the Japanese memorial landscape, but no less personally significant. The men who served on the radar picket stations, who fought the fires on the fleet carriers, who flew the interception missions off Okinawa, have carried this history in their own ways for 8 decades. Some have written about it. Some have spoken at schools and museums. Some never spoke about it at all, in the way that many combat veterans of all nations and all wars have found silence to be the only adequate response to experiences that language has difficulty reaching. Their silence is also part of the historical record, evidence that the experience of being under kamikaze attack was something that resisted the ordinary narrative forms through which people communicate experience to those who were not there. History has a responsibility to those silences, as much as to the words that were spoken. Chapter 15. The pilots of the Oka, purpose-built for one thing. To understand the full scope of the kamikaze program, you must sit with the Oka for longer than most accounts allow. The cherry blossom aircraft, designed from conception to be flown once by one man in one direction, represents the most concentrated expression of the kamikaze logic in engineering form. Where the zero-based kamikaze involved an aircraft being repurposed from an original design that included survival, the Oka was designed with no pretense of anything else. It had no undercarriage for landing. Its cockpit offered no parachute provision in the combat version. It was an airframe built around a warhead, with control surfaces sufficient to guide it to a target and a rocket motor to ensure that guidance could not be interrupted at the final stage. The Oka was the idea of Ensign Mitsuo Ota, a transport pilot who submitted his proposal to the Naval Air Technical Arsenal in June of 1944, the same month as the catastrophic Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ota's proposal drew on his observation that conventional air attacks against well-defended American fleets were producing minimal results at maximum human and material cost, and that a small, purpose-built, human-guided weapon could deliver a large warhead with a precision that no existing conventional weapon could match. The Naval Air Technical Arsenal took over the design, producing the first prototype in a remarkably short period. By the autumn of 1944, the basic design was complete, and powered test flights began in November. The speed of development reflected the urgency of the strategic situation, but it also meant that the aircraft's operational deployment preceded the full development of effective tactics for its use. The Oka Model 11, the primary operational version, carried a nose warhead of approximately 1,200 kilograms, a charge substantially larger than the 250-kilogram bomb carried by a Zero on a standard kamikaze mission. The theoretical penetrating and explosive effect of a 1,200-kilogram warhead delivered at terminal velocity against a warship's structure was, in engineering terms, potentially catastrophic. The USS Mana El Abel, as we noted in an earlier chapter, was broken in half by an Orca strike on the 12th of April, 1945. The weapon, when it reached its target, worked. The difficulty was getting it to the target. The parent aircraft, The Mitsubishi G4M twin-engine bomber carrying the Orca beneath its fuselage was slow, large, and visible on radar from considerable distance. It had to approach close enough to the target for the Orca pilot, once released, to glide and then rocket to the target. A release altitude typically in the range of roughly 6,000 to 8,000 meters, at a distance of perhaps 30 to 40 kilometers from the target. Within those parameters, the G4M was highly vulnerable to interception by combat air patrol fighters, the Orca pilots who flew these missions, and there were approximately 850 men who trained for the Orca program, occupied a particular psychological and institutional position, even within the broader kamikaze framework. They were not generic volunteers assigned to the program. They were specifically selected, given dedicated training in the Orca's distinctive handling characteristics, its glide ratio, its speed management in the unpowered phase, the timing of rocket ignition, the target acquisition geometry at terminal approach. They trained in unpowered variants, designated the Model 11K, which had an undercarriage fitted for conventional landing, allowing pilots to rehearse every phase of the mission up to the moment of rocket ignition. This training was real and demanding. The men who underwent it were not simply climbing into a weapon and aiming at a target. They were learning to fly a specific aircraft with specific characteristics to a specific performance standard, in the knowledge that the final flight would be the only one that mattered. The accounts left by Orca pilots, and there are fewer of these than for the broader kamikaze program, reflecting the smaller number of men involved, and the operational circumstances of a program that was less extensively documented at unit level, suggest a training environment that combined technical rigor with the same complex emotional atmosphere as the rest of the special attack program. The men who trained together in the Orca units formed intense personal bonds, in the way that people under extreme shared pressure tend to do. The training cadre, officers who had responsibility for preparing men they were sending to certain death, navigated the same institutional and personal contradictions documented elsewhere in the program. The necessity of maintaining military composure and the human difficulty of doing so in specific circumstances. The operational record of the Orca is, in purely military terms, a story of greater potential than actual achievement. The weapon's first combat deployment, the mission of the 19th of March, 1945, in which 16 G4M bombers carrying Orca were intercepted before they could release their weapons, and every bomber was destroyed, established the pattern that the deployment challenge would impose throughout the campaign. When the G4M reached release range without being intercepted, the Orca's speed and trajectory made it very difficult to stop. When the G4M was intercepted while still carrying the Orca, which slowed the bomber and degraded its maneuverability significantly, the entire formation was lost, along with the bomber crews and the Orca pilots locked in their cockpits with no means of escape. The asymmetry between the weapon's potential and the difficulty of realizing that potential through the delivery system available is one of the most instructive case studies in the history of weapons development. A detail that is not often discussed in accounts of the Orca program is the experience of the Orca pilot in the parent aircraft during the approach flight. From the moment he entered the Orca's cockpit beneath the G4M's fuselage, an event that took place on the ground before takeoff, to the moment of release, the Orca pilot was enclosed in a small, dark cockpit with a very restricted field of view, unable to communicate freely with the parent aircraft's crew, unable to do anything to influence what was happening, entirely dependent on the G4M crew's decisions about approach, timing, and release. If the G4M was attacked by fighters, the Orca pilot had no means of escape and no ability to contribute to the aircraft's defense. In the mission of the 19th of March, in which every G4M was lost before release. Every Oka pilot died in the belly of the parent aircraft, rather than in the approach run they had trained for. This detail, the passivity of the weapon's final human operator in the phase where his vulnerability was highest, adds a specific quality to the account of what these men experienced that the general kamikaze narrative does not capture. The Oka program also produced variants that were never used in combat. A submarine-launched version was designed, intended to be released from a submerged submarine against a ship at anchor or moving slowly. A concept that anticipated the submarine-launched cruise missile by several decades in its basic logic, though the human guidance element placed it firmly within the kamikaze framework, rather than the automated weapons development tradition. A catapult-launched version was developed for ground-based operations, intended for use against the invasion fleet in the waters close to the Japanese home islands. These variants, still in development or in limited production at the war's end, are evidence that the Japanese engineering and weapons development community had genuinely internalized the Oka's basic concept and was working to extend it into new operational domains. They are also evidence, like the aircraft stockpiles waiting at Kyushu, of the scale of what was being prepared for the invasion that the atomic bomb prevented from being necessary. The legacy of the Oka in post-war weapons development is traceable in a direct line to the anti-ship cruise missile, a weapon that takes the Oka's defining characteristic, the ability to guide a large warhead to a maneuvering target at high speed with terminal precision, and removes the human pilot while retaining and improving the guidance capability through electronic means. The Soviet P-15 Termit, the French Exocet, the American Harpoon. All of these weapons are, in a broad conceptual sense, the Oka with the man removed, and the guidance system replaced by electronics that can do what the man could do while accepting none of the cost. The Oka's designers were not the first people in history to think about the problem of putting a large explosive charge on a maneuvering ship with precision, but they were among the first to construct an elegant, if terrible, engineering solution to the specific sub-problem of terminal guidance. And the solution they constructed pointed directly toward the missile era that followed. The Oka's name, Cherry Blossom, and the Zero's use as a kamikaze vehicle, and the entire naming vocabulary of the Special Attack Corps all drew on an aesthetics of impermanence that is deeply embedded in Japanese classical culture. The cherry blossom falls before it fades. Its beauty is inseparable from its brevity. The use of this imagery to frame the deaths of young men in a suicide weapons program is not, and this needs to be said clearly, an innocent aesthetic choice. It is an ideological technology. It transforms death into something pre-designated as beautiful, pre-framed as meaningful, pre-absorbed into a cultural vocabulary that makes resistance to it feel like a rejection, not just of a military order, but of one's deepest cultural identity. Understanding how that technology worked, how it shaped the experience of the men inside the program, requires neither celebrating it nor dismissing it, but examining it carefully, which is what this documentary has tried to do. Chapter 16. The Mathematics of Sacrifice. What the kamikaze actually achieved. There is a point in the examination of any military campaign at which the historian must sit down with the numbers and ask the hardest version of the question. Did it work? Not in the shallow sense of whether individual attacks succeeded, in the deeper sense of whether the campaign, at the strategic level, achieved what its architects intended. For the kamikaze, this question has been examined extensively by military historians, by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, and by Japanese post-war analysts, and the answer they have produced is both more complex and more uncomfortable than the simple answer of no, that popular history often implies. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, completed in the immediate post-war period, estimated that kamikaze attacks accounted for approximately 14% of American ships damaged and approximately 8.5% of American ships sunk in the Pacific War. From the first attacks in October of 1944 through the end of the war, these are not negligible figures. Across the entire Pacific campaign, kamikaze attacks sank 34 ships and damaged 368 more. From destroyers and destroyer escorts to fleet carriers and battleships, the human cost to the United States Navy, approximately 4,900 killed and approximately 4,800 wounded by kamikaze attack, was the highest suffered from any single weapon or tactical system deployed against American naval forces in the entire war. To set these numbers against any alternative account of what conventionally employed aircraft could have achieved with the same resources, given the training levels available in 1944 and 45, is to produce a comparison that, on the narrow military metric of damage per aircraft expended, favors the kamikaze significantly. But the strategic question is not about damage per aircraft. It is about whether the campaign altered the outcome of the war. And on this question, the answer is clear. It did not. The United States Navy, despite its losses, continued to operate and advance. The logistical flow supporting the island campaigns was never interrupted for any strategically significant period. The American carrier fleet, despite the losses inflicted at Okinawa and in the Philippines, remained fully capable of conducting offensive operations through the war's end. The industrial and manpower base that sustained American naval operations in the Pacific was not measurably affected by the kamikaze campaign. Japan lost the war. The kamikaze was, in the strategic calculus of the Pacific War, a weapon that imposed serious tactical costs without altering the strategic trajectory. Where this simple negative conclusion requires qualification is in the operational domain. In the specific effect the campaign had on American planning and decision-making, the diversion of more than 2,000 B-29 sorties from the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities and industry to attacks on kamikaze airfields in Kyushu is one example of this operational disruption. The delay and complication imposed on the Okinawa campaign's timetable by the sustained kamikaze pressure is another. The specific damage to individual ships that removed them from operations at critical moments. The damage to USS Bunker Hill that removed Admiral Mitchell's flagship from the final phase of the Okinawa campaign, for instance, had real if limited operational consequences. And the effect on American invasion planning of the projected kamikaze threat at Okinawa, the factor that contributed to the casualty estimates for Operation Downfall that were circulating in Washington in the summer of 1945, was, potentially, the most significant strategic effect of the entire program, in that it influenced decisions about how to end the war that reverberate through history to the present day. The question of how to account for the human cost of the kamikaze program to Japan itself is one that the strategic analysis tends to obscure. Approximately 3,800 pilots died in kamikaze missions. The total human investment in the program, pilots, escort aircrew, ground personnel, was substantially higher. The aircraft expended numbered in the thousands. This investment came from a Japanese economy and military establishment that were already under severe resource pressure in the final year of the war. The decision to continue and expand the kamikaze program, rather than redirecting these resources toward conventional air defense of the home islands, toward the naval forces attempting to protect the supply lines, toward any other military purpose, is one that historians have examined as a question of strategic priority as well as operational effectiveness. The consensus view is that the conventional alternatives available with the same resources would have been less effective against the specific military challenge. Japan faced in 1944 and 45 than the kamikaze program was, given the training levels available. But the program's consumption of human capital, young men who might, in a different strategic environment, have formed the core of a post-war reconstruction effort, is a cost that the military effectiveness accounting does not capture. The post-war Japanese academic debate about the kamikaze's military effectiveness has been shaped by the same broader tensions that characterize Japanese war memory generally. The difficulty of discussing military failure without appearing to impugn the sacrifice of the men who died, and the difficulty of discussing those men's sacrifice with appropriate respect, without appearing to validate the ideological framework that produced it. The mainstream Japanese academic consensus, as best it can be characterized, holds that the kamikaze was a military tactic that produced real but insufficient effects against a materially superior adversary, deployed in a context of strategic and institutional failure that the tactic itself could not repair, and that its human cost, to the pilots, to their families, and to Japan's post-war human capital, must be accounted alongside its military effects. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one, and it is broadly consistent with the evidence assembled across this documentary. The comparison to other forms of extreme military sacrifice under resource pressure is one that historians occasionally make, and that deserves careful treatment. The Soviet Union's use of penal battalions on the Eastern Front, formations sent into combat under conditions of near certain death as a form of institutional compulsion dressed as military necessity, shares structural features with the kamikaze program without sharing its cultural framing or its specific military logic. The German military's late war deployment of adolescents and old men in formations that had no prospect of affecting the outcome similarly reflects the logic of a military establishment under existential pressure reaching for human resources that it could not fully prepare or sustain. The kamikaze is not unique in being the product of a losing military establishment extracting human sacrifice from young people in the service of a cause already lost. What it is, perhaps, is the most systematically organized and culturally elaborated version of that pattern in the modern era of warfare. The one that built the most complete institutional infrastructure around the extraction of sacrifice, and that left the richest documentation of what that extraction cost the individuals inside it. The American sailors killed in kamikaze attacks occupy a specific and somewhat poorly recognized place in the memory of the Pacific War. Their deaths are documented in the official records of the United States Navy. Their names appear on memorials. But the specific nature of the weapon that killed them, the specific quality of what it meant to be struck by a deliberately guided human weapon, has received less sustained public attention than the more famous landmarks of the Pacific War's human cost. The naval historians and the veterans organizations that have worked to document and preserve the account of the radar picket stations and the fleet carriers under kamikaze attack at Okinawa have been working against a tide of public memory that tends toward the large symbolic moments and away from the sustained, grinding, psychologically distinctive suffering of men holding the line in open water against an enemy who was not going to turn back. Their persistence in this work is part of what makes the history available to a documentary like this one. The final military accounting of the kamikaze campaign: 3,800 aircraft expended, 34 Allied ships sunk, 368 damaged, approximately 4,900 Allied sailors killed, sits in the historical record as evidence of a tactic that was, in its narrow military terms, among the most cost-effective weapons Japan deployed in the Pacific War's final year, and that failed nonetheless to alter the war's outcome. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic at the center of the story. It does not vindicate the program. It does not vindicate the ideology that produced it, or the institutional coercion that sustained it, but it does demand to be looked at honestly, because the alternative, dismissing the kamikaze as simply irrational fanaticism that naturally failed, misrepresents the evidence in a way that prevents the actual lessons from being learned. The lessons are available. The evidence is there. The work of looking at it carefully, without the comfortable shortcuts of either condemnation or glorification, is the work this documentary has been attempting. Chapter 17, The Last Wind, Final Reckoning, and What Remains. We have been traveling through this history for a long time now. Across 16 chapters, we have examined the rise and fall of Japanese naval aviation, the desperate strategic arithmetic that produced the kamikaze program, the human texture of the men who flew and the men who were struck, the engineering of specific weapons, the tactics of both attack and defense, the institutional learning that followed, and the long, unfinished process of memory and reckoning. It is time in this final chapter to gather what we have found and to ask what it means. Not to resolve it into a verdict, because history does not issue verdicts, but to hold it with the honesty it deserves. The kamikaze campaign ran from October of 1944 to August of 1945. 10 months of organized, institutionalized, human-guided attack on Allied naval forces that killed nearly 5,000 American sailors, damaged hundreds of ships, and imposed a psychological and operational pressure on the United States Navy, unlike anything it had previously experienced. It was preceded by years of Japanese naval excellence that make the desperation of its origins more, not less, tragic. Because the men who designed it knew what Japanese naval aviation had been at its height, and knew how completely that height had been lost by the time the first Zero fighter was pointed at a carrier deck in the Philippine Sea. The distance between the triumphant first wave at Pearl Harbor and the barely trained teenagers dying in training aircraft off Okinawa 3.5 years later is one of the most dramatic and most instructive arcs in the military history of the 20th century. What the history demands of us, as readers and viewers and people engaging with this material at this distance, is something more than condemnation or admiration, or the comfortable displacement of all moral weight onto the ideology and the institution. The ideology was real and was genuinely monstrous in its demands. The institution was real and was genuinely coercive in its methods. And the individuals inside that ideology and that institution were also real. Young, intelligent, frightened, loving, capable of doubt, carrying relationships and memories and private futures that the institution's demands erased. All of these things are simultaneously true. Holding them simultaneously is uncomfortable. It is also the minimum that honest engagement with this history requires. The men of the Allied navies who faced the kamikaze, who watched aircraft come out of the sky in deliberate, controlled, irreversible dives at their ships, were also placed in circumstances that this history requires us to hold with honesty. They were doing their jobs. Their jobs in the spring of 1945 required them to stand on the radar picket stations in open water and wait for attacks that came in waves, knowing that the aircraft bearing down on their ships had been pointed at them by a human hand that had decided not to turn back. Their courage was not a simple courage, not the courage of a single crisis moment, but the courage of sustained endurance under conditions that offered no resolution and no certainty and very little protection. They deserve to be remembered not as background figures in a story that is primarily about the attackers, but as full participants in a history that cost them, in specific and documented ways, an enormous amount. The post-war world that both sides of this history helped to create, the world in which Japan and the United States became, within a decade of the war's end, close allies and trading partners, and gradually something approaching genuine friends, is one of the more remarkable developments in the diplomatic history of the 20th century. It did not happen automatically or without difficulty. It required, on both sides, deliberate choices about how to relate to the recent past, choices about which memories to foreground and which to set aside, about how to build a working relationship across the ruins of a war in which each side had done things to the other that would take generations to process fully. The kamikaze campaign sits in the middle of that relationship, a specific episode that neither side has found it easy to discuss directly in the context of the alliance, and that the passage of time has allowed to be somewhat reframed as historical, rather than personal, as something that happened between nations in a time of conflict, rather than something that one specific generation of Japanese young men did to one specific generation of American sailors. The islands where the most intense kamikaze fighting took place, Okinawa most prominently, are not neutral sites of memory. Okinawa is a part of Japan that has its own complex relationship with the Japanese mainland's memory of the war, shaped by the fact that Okinawan civilians died in numbers that dwarf the Japanese military casualties, and by the fact that the island's population has lived since the war under the continuing presence of American military bases that have generated their own political tensions and their own civilian costs. The Okinawan perspective on the kamikaze campaign is not the same as the Japanese mainland perspective, and it is not the same as the American naval perspective. It is the perspective of a civilian population that was caught between two military forces, neither of which was primarily concerned with civilian welfare, and that paid a price in deaths and displacement and cultural trauma that was out of proportion to anything that could be justified by any military logic. The Okinawan dead deserve to be named in any serious accounting of what the spring of 1945 cost, which is why the cornerstone of peace, with its more than 240,000 inscribed names of all nationalities, is perhaps the most honest memorial that exists for that campaign. The technical legacy, as we examined in Chapter 13, runs forward into the guided missile era and into the naval architecture of every major navy operating today. The doctrinal legacy runs forward into the layered fleet defense systems that structure naval operations in the 21st century. The intelligence legacy runs forward into the analytical frameworks through which modern intelligence communities evaluate adversary weapons, systems, and intentions. These are not abstract or distant legacies. They are present in the hardware and the doctrine and the training of contemporary navies in ways that a working naval officer could, if asked, trace back specifically to lessons learned at Okinawa in the spring of 1945. History is not always visible in the present, but this piece of it is, in the missile systems, in the Combat Information Center doctrine, in the carrier design philosophy of every major naval power. The men who trained for the kamikaze and survived, who had prepared themselves for death, and then found themselves alive in a Japan that had surrendered and was becoming something they did not recognize, carried a particular form of the war's aftermath, not the aftermath of having killed, not the aftermath of having been wounded, the aftermath of having been prepared completely for a specific death in a specific cause for which the death never came and the cause was declared lost. The psychological literature on this form of survival, on the aftermath of interrupted sacrifice, is not extensive because it is a relatively unusual form of experience. But the accounts that exist from the men who spoke and wrote about it in the decades after the war describe something that does not fit neatly into either the victor's narrative or the loser's narrative. They describe people trying to find a way to live forward from a point that had been designated as terminal, in a world that had moved on without providing a framework for what they were carrying. The Chiron Peace Museum's display of letters and photographs ends at the moment of departure. The camera, metaphorically, and in some cases literally, holds on the last image of the man who is leaving, and then the exhibit moves to the next pilot. What happens after departure, on the water and in the air, and on the decks of the ships that were struck, is not the museum's subject. This documentary has tried to hold both sides of the moment of departure, both the men who left and the men and ships that received them, because both sides are part of the same history, and because separating them produces an incomplete account. The history of the kamikaze at sea is not the history of the Japanese Special Attack Corps alone. It is the history of a specific 10 months of the Pacific War, in which a particular form of human-guided weapons system was deployed at scale, met by a particular form of adaptive defense, and left a legacy in metal, in doctrine, in memory, in the testimony of survivors on every side, that we are still, in important ways, living with. The Pacific Ocean is very large and very old. The battles fought across it in the 1940s left very little visible trace on its surface. The ships that sank rest on the ocean floor in depths that make them largely inaccessible. The aircraft, the Zeros, the Hellcats, the Corsairs, the Oka, have almost all been consumed by salt water and time. What remains is the documentary record and the human memory, the letters in the archive, and the ship's logs, and the after-action reports, and the oral histories gathered from aging survivors before the window closed. This documentary has been built from that record, assembled over months of research, organized by a human mind trying to do justice to a history that is too important and too complicated to be summarized quickly. If it has given you something useful, a more complete picture, a more honest framework, a deeper respect for the complexity of what happened in those waters, then the work was worth doing. The wind that the kamikaze program was named for, the great storms that protected Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century, was real in the sense that storms are real, but it was not divine intervention. It was weather. The young men who were asked, and sometimes coerced, and sometimes genuinely chose to be the instrument of a second divine wind. They were not divine either. They were human, fully, completely, complicated human beings in an impossible situation, doing what they could with what they had been given, and what they had been told, and what, in the private space of the letters they left behind, they actually felt. That is the whole of what history can say about them. It is enough.